directly involved in political partisan debate? How may militaries establish bonds with the broader society to deepen mutual understanding between military and society? How can civilian oversight institutions be strengthened without generating encroachments into the military's specificity and functions? Today, we gather to follow up on that debate and go one step further, to inquire about the relationship between civil-military relations and defense reforms, namely focusing on one specific issue, the restructuring of military high command. At a moment when there is an ongoing debate in Portugal regarding this public policy issue, it is important to enhance the ongoing discussions by providing historical and analytical background, accurate information on other experiences, by comparing processes and identifying lessons learned. That is vital for the quality of our assessments and diagnosis, vital to understand the conditions under which reforms and policies may succeed or fumble, to anticipate, prioritize, and plan. That is the objective of this webinar. And that is also why we invited a group of distinguished national and international scholars of civil-military relations and security studies, who I would like to thank wholeheartedly for accepting the invitation, especially Tom Bruno, if you allow me, because it's 6 o'clock in the morning where in California, and he's with us already. Thank you. Thank you all. We already know a few things about public policy change, that there are no automatic and ahistorical recipes for change. Sometimes there are sudden ruptures, but most of the time there are incremental changes. We know that context is extremely important, that in sovereignty matters, broad political consensus is mandatory, that policy effectiveness requires involving stakeholders and promoting ownership, that reforming involves dealing with gatekeepers, resistance to change, and fear of uncertainty. And we also know that in democratic societies, civilian control of the armed forces is a founding political principle, because it is the people, through their democratically elected representatives, who are the principal, who are the owners of it all. This is a note for the Portuguese audience. We know that the classical dilemma of democratic civil-military relations, how to reconcile a military strong enough to do anything the civilians ask them to do, with a military subordinate enough to do only what civilians authorize them to do, while still relevant, has been superseded by additional concerns. In consolidated democracies, the focus has moved from understanding the institutionalization of civilian control to explaining different degrees of civil-military conflict and cooperation. The focus has moved towards the governance of the armed forces, to the best ways to ensure their adequacy to the many challenges I mentioned before, and to ensure accountability between them and the societies they serve. The most pressing issues relate to the day-to-day nature of the relationship between armed forces, civilians and the military, in the funding, organization, and conduct of the armed forces, and not on a distorted assumption of a constitutive military ambition to intervene in politics, even if that has become a matter for concern in different parts of the world. In Portugal, we live in a consolidated democracy where our military have strongly incorporated a democratic political culture and are focused on their missions, accomplishing them in ways that make a whole country proud, even in the face of limited resources, material and human resources, which are, of course, problems we also need to address. These are things we know. But there is also much knowledge we need to share and feed into the public debate. Here at the IDN, or wherever we want, whenever we want, and with whoever we want, because defense is a citizenship issue, not the field of a few Illuminati. In what regards the specific topic of military high command, we should ask, what are the main trends regarding defense reforms in other countries, in NATO, Europe, and beyond? How do they relate to specific patterns of civil-military relations? To what extent do historical legacies and political contexts impact the type, scope, and rhythm of the reforms undertaken? Which are the conditions to ensure effective implementation? These are some questions we ask our guest speakers to address, thus contributing to a rational and comprehensive discussion of the issues at stake. And without further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira, who kindly agreed to give the opening address in this webinar. Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira is the director of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, full professor and former vice-rector of Universidade Nova de Lisboa. He holds a PhD in History of International Relations from the European University Institute in Florence, and aggregate in Political Science and International Relations from Universidade Nova de Lisboa. He was visiting scholar at Georgetown University and visiting scholar at University of California, Berkeley. He was also the director of the National Defense Institute, Minister of Internal Affairs, and Minister of Defense of the Portuguese government. And last but not least, he has published extensively on military history, history of international relations, history of European construction and foreign policy, security and defense issues. Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira, the floor is yours.
Director of IDN, Helena, thank you very much, first of all, for this very kind invitation and the opportunity to share with you some ideas about the reform of defense, and more than this, to be with some friends around the world. Thank you very much. So I was asked to speak a little bit about this reform of the higher structure of the armed forces. It's what I'm going to do, try to do. As you all know, the reform of the higher structure of the armed forces has been subject of recent debate in Portugal, motivated by the government's proposal to amend the national defense law, and especially the organic basic law of the organization of the armed forces. It has been, until now, a technical debate, a military technical debate, very, I would say, difficult to follow by the public opinion in general. So a debate which has developed between military personalities, high qualified military personalities, political leaders, some academics, but until now has not mobilized the Portuguese society. And now I would like to congratulate the IDN and its director, Professora Helena Carreiras, on this initiative, which may open the debate, not only to compare the perspective, which is always important in international terms, but also which may open the debate in Portugal, in the Portuguese public opinion. This is neither the time nor the place to discuss technical issues or to argue technical arguments, but there is one question that I think that interests of all of the citizens. As Helena said, defense is a citizenship issue, so interests to all the citizens, and we all can understand. And the question is, what is the political and strategic context of this reform, and whether or not this reform meets the national interest in Portugal today? So I will address this issue beginning from two very simple and very brief reflections. The first one on a general context, on the strategic environment that shapes the reform of the armed forces actually. And second, on the national context, on how the issue of the reform of defense and higher structure of the armed forces have been discussed and evolved in Portugal. And in particular, if there is or not a Portuguese exceptionality in this issue. So let's begin by the first question, the general context. The command structure of the armed forces, as well as the military service model, are historical phenomena. They evolve with the strategic environment, the nature of the threats, and the nature of the missions of the armed forces. As you all know better than me, until the Cold War, threats to state security came from other states. So they were military threats of a strictly military nature, and which was translated into the invasion of the territory. So the missions of the armed forces were territorial defense missions, what we usually used to say the mainland defense, the homeland defense. These missions of armed forces, these missions of homeland defense required mass armies, first of all, and which the mandatory military service, I mean the conscription, made possible, and an autonomous command according with the nature of the mission, with the nature of the operations, I mean land or sea or air operation. By the end of the Second World War, something changed. And the major amphibious operations using land, sea, and air at the same time, such as the Normandy landing, dictated in 1944, dictated two main things. On one hand, the reinforcement of the political direction of the operations, and on the other hand, the reinforcement of the need of the strategic cooperation, the strategic coordination between or among the different branches of the operation. So NATO in the 50s came to enshrine this trend with the creation of the ministries of defense in all countries. In Portugal, it was the secretary, the National Secretary for Defense, the first structure in this sense, and at the same time, the General Staff of the Armed Forces. So the end of the Cold War changed completely the strategic environment. Non-state actors came into the scene, threats, both military and non-military threats came into the scene. So they became at the same time transnational threats, terrorism, organized crime, failed states, and so on. And consequently, the missions of the armed forces are no longer of homeland defense, but have become missions of security productions. The armed forces are today security providers to some extent, and this kind of missions miles and miles away of the country, of the homeland, if we can say. So in these cases, these new kind of missions after the Cold War require professional military personnel and more a unified strategic command. At the present juncture, so today, currently, proxy warfare, hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, the use of the disruptive technologies further reinforce the need for a joint command and the use of military forces to tackle these new kind of threats and new kind of challenges that the armed forces are facing today. So this was along this period from the beginning of the end of the Cold War, what has made the reforms necessary in different countries, in NATO and EU allies. They have, all of them have reformed their armed forces to dispropose the higher structure of the armed forces. So what happened was that states with the armed forces of more or less the same size of the Portuguese armed forces extinguished the general staffs of the different branches of the armed forces and concentrated in a joint general staff. It was the case of Belgium, it was the case of Netherlands, it was the case of Sweden, it was the case of Denmark. And on the other hand, states with larger armed forces, like Spain, like France, like UK, just to mention European allies, they maintained the general staffs of the different branches, but oriented towards recruitment, training, and sustainment, and the Joint Chief of the Staff oriented to the operational command. What I think is now in Portugal being discussed is a solution that maintains the different branches of the different general staffs of the branches, but oriented to this kind of functions. I mean, recruiting, training, and sustaining. So this is the panorama, the general panorama among the European allies in NATO and EU. And if I am not wrong, since the Spanish reform, Felix Arteaga will say about it, but I think that since 2015, Portugal appears to be the only among the allies with whom Portugal cooperates closely in the international missions, that has not accompanied this kind of change in the higher structure of the armed forces. So this is the general panorama. Now let me focus on the second topic, my second topic, which is the Portuguese, the national context. Is there, the question that we can raise is why Portugal is the only one in this context? Is there a Portuguese exceptionality or not? Well, certainly yes, certainly so. The past weighs on national memory, and the past weighs on the memory of the institutions, of course. And there is something that we can say that an historical inertia in societies, and this is the case in Portugal. First, let me remember that during the authoritarian regime, the three branches of the armed forces had a seat in the government. We had the Ministry of the Army, the Ministry of the Navy, and the Secretary of State of the Secretary of State of the Air Force. But this is a general model. But we have in Portugal another exceptionality, which is the transition to democracy. I mean, that during the transition to democracy and the democratization process, the armed forces exerced a military tutelage over the democracy. It was the time of the Council of the Revolution, and it was not. It was only with the National Defense Law and the first revision of the Constitution in 1982 that the Council of the Revolution was extinguished and the military withdrew from politics.
I think we lost Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira for a while. Let's just wait a little bit to see whether we can regain contact. I believe he probably left and will try to come in again. That is one of the solutions for this kind of technical problems. So let us wait a couple of minutes to see whether we can have Professor Nunes Ferreira Teixeira back in the room.
Agora já está. Agora já está. I'm very sorry, something went wrong. But I was saying, are you hearing me now? Okay. So I was saying that in this process, Sá Carneiro on one hand and Mário Soares on the other played a decisive role. I mean, for those who are not familiar with the Portuguese party system, this is the main parties in Portugal, center-left and center-right. What happened from that moment on? Since then, Portugal, what happened in Portugal since then was that since the end of the Cold War, successive governments have wanted to adapt the Portuguese armed forces to strategic challenges they would face ahead. And since 1991, this is the first date, all governments have included in their government programs the plan to reorganize the armed forces in order to meet the demands, the challenges, the strategic challenges, and the demands of a greater centralization, if we can say, of the command and the joint employment of the armed forces. However, other priorities came to the fore, and only in 2009, a government from the Socialist Party, and in 2014, another government from the Social Democratic and Social Democratic Party and Social Democratic Center, CDS and PSD, put into action what was in the program of the government, the government program, and what made the currently situation regarding the national defense law and the basic organic law of the armed forces in order to strengthen the joint command and the powers of the chief of staff, the general chief of staff. But as Elena already said, there were some resistances from the branches of the armed forces, which is absolutely natural. And there was also political compromises that were necessary to reach a consensus. And so both reforms in 2009 and 2014 remain far from the objectives initially proposed. So the current government now returns with a new proposal for the reform of the higher structure of the armed forces, which is under discussion, public discussion, and will be taken to the parliament. I don't know, I'm not sure, but I think next week or in the next 2 weeks. Which is the real meaning of this new proposal for the reform of the armed forces? Well, I would say that it does not mean a breakup, it does not mean a revolution, but rather the completion of the 2009 and 2014 reforms. And more than this, it would be if the reform is approved by the parliament, of course, would be the closing of a cycle, a long cycle coming from the end of the Cold War, I mean, from 1991. Well, my opinion on the reform has been known since I had political responsibilities in the reform in 2009, and I have recently publicly expressed my opinion in Portuguese media, because I don't want to go in the arguments, in the technical details, but if you allow me, I would say that there are 2 or 3 general remarks, general comments that I would like to do before closing these comments. First, I think, and it is my personal opinion, of course, and only my personal opinion. First, the reform tackles the strategic challenges currently faced by the armed forces in general, and by the Portuguese armed forces. Second, it aligns the Portuguese armed forces with the armed forces of the allies, of the other allied countries with which Portugal cooperates every day in international missions all over the world. And finally, just to trying to answer to my first question, well, I think this is a reform that corresponds to the national interest, the Portuguese national interest today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be trying to see the rest of the seminar. Apologizing from this moment because I would have to leave a little bit early because I have an academic seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nunes Brilhante Teixeira. Thank you for joining us and giving us this opening address. We are right on time to proceed to our first panel, and I profit from this occasion to thank the 2 chairs of this seminar, Dr. João Rebelo, who is the president of the Portuguese Commission of the Atlantic, who will chair the first panel, and Professor Ana Santos Pinto, who will do the same in the second panel. Thank you very much for helping us in this debate. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. João Rebelo, who will chair our first panel. Okay. The floor is yours, João.
Thank you very much, Helena. Thank you very much to the Institute of National Defense for the invitation. As Professor Helena Carreiras said, I am actually the president of the Portuguese Atlantic Committee, and we work together with the National Defense Institute with a lot of projects, so I'm very happy to be here with you. Also, to extend all the all the greetings to everyone on the panels, to my colleague Anas Pinto that will be in the second panels, to everyone that are listening to us. A lot of people, I see the number is rising each time, with people with a lot of responsibility, which would be very interesting to debate in this webinar. I will not say anything more because I was totally I agree fully with what Nuno Severino Teixeira, Professor Severino Teixeira told. He was Minister of Defense when I was a member of Parliament, and one of the reforms was with him, and my party, at the Christian Democrat, in the opposition at that times, give the support to the first reform that was made at that time.
Very well.
in that government. And then we did a second one in 2014, and now we are debating a third one, but I'm no longer in the parliament, but I recall how hard it was to debate and to find common grounds, but we made it, and it was an excellent work that Professor Nuno Severino Teixeira, as a minister, did as a work. So, coming for our debate and our panel. I have the great pleasure in the first panel. The subject is civil-military relation and defense reform. We'll have Thomas Bruno, that is in California, will be the first one, but first I will present the second one, Bruno Cardoso Reis. Before introduction, both of them, I want to say some information for everyone that want to participate on the debates. After that, after the presentation, both panelists will be open to respond questions. How can you put the questions? It's using the chat room. It must be written in English, and then I will read it for both of our panelists, the questions. Please be brief on your question. I know that it's a very important topic, but if you can be brief, it will be open to have more questions to everyone that wants to participate and put questions to Tom and to Bruno. I will now give the floor to Bruno. I will present Bruno a little bit because he's in California right now, so it's good morning for him. Thomas Bruno is a distinguished professor emeritus of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School at Monterey, California. He joined the department in 1987, became the chairman in 1989, and continued in that position until 1995. He became director of the Center for Civil-Military Relations in November 2000, a position he held until December 2004. He left the US government service in February 2013. He had a lot of books published, a lot of them. I will not read them because it's truly fantastic work that he's doing on the publishing books, articles, and working with in a lot of different range of civil and military affairs. That is very important. Between 1998 and 2001, he served as rapporteur of the Defense Policy Board that provides the Secretary of Defense and his staff with independent advice on questions of national security and defense policy. So the floor is yours, Tom, and thank you very much to be with us from California.
Okay. Do I have 20 minutes?
Sorry?
Do I have 20 minutes?
You have 20 minutes, exactly.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's so strange to learn so many things about Portugal while speaking English. So thank you very much. When I was asked if I would do this, realizing it was 6 a.m. in the morning here in California, I was very happy to, because my contact with the EDN goes very far back. I was on sabbatical in Lisbon in 1992-93, studying precisely these types of issues. And I'd had a grant from the Office of Secretary of Defense in the United States to study the defense policies of Spain and Portugal. That turned out to be a study of civil military relations, because As you know, you and Spain were going through transitions at that time, and it was a matter of figuring out these types of issues about NATO and EU and base access and all those types of things. So I learned a great deal at the EDN at that time, and ever since I've been back there many, many times. What I would like to do in these 15 minutes or so is basically to provide the background for the framework that I utilize and I try to propagandize for the understanding of civil-military relations, within which this dimension of the high command is a key element. So let me just go back through a little bit of the experience, because I think it might help some of the audience there that might be developing questions. So the background is based basically on three different experiences. One is we created here at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey in the early 1990s, a new program in civil-military relations. This was the end of the Cold War, and the international military education and training money became available for doing democratic civil-military relations, human rights, these types of things. And I became very, very active in that. And in that, we offer master's programs here. And I was teaching many of these programs on civil-military relations and democratic consolidation, intelligence in a democracy, these types of things, to students from all over the world, 50 different countries, Africa, Soviet Union, ex-Soviet Union, Latin America, Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, through that center where I became director, I did short programs, one-week programs, seminars, in probably 40 different countries, all of Latin America except Venezuela, but in Bulgaria, Armenia, Angola, Nepal, et cetera, et cetera. And that experience, these were one-week programs, some I did every year, for example, in El Salvador or in Chile. These programs, combined with what I was trying to teach in the courses that I was teaching, utilizing material on civil-military relations, made me realize that most of that material was a bunch of nonsense. It was just not very good at all. It just had, you know, our students here are all military officers, junior officers. So we have a certain exposure to what the military really is like. So this motivated me in the first instance to try to make a contribution based upon what I learned in these programs throughout the world, which normally bring together 20 or 25 military officers, lieutenant colonels, colonels, generals, along with civilians in ministries of defense. So that motivated me to learn something and to put it into writing so that others could accept it, reject it, or build on it. The second thing was that in 1999 to about 2004, we, through our center, had a program. We got a lot of money through our congressman here who followed Leon Panetta before Jimmy Panetta. So his name was Congressman Sam Farr, and he had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Medellin, Colombia. And he was on the House Appropriations Committee. And those people basically write checks. So he got us some money, and we worked basically very closely with President-elect Uribe, because you could say what you want now, and things are different now, but at that time, he was going to take on the FARC, you know, which had basically a terrorist group, which had basically made that country just about impossible to live and to work in. So I spent a great deal of time with President Uribe and his government, basically trying to help them become effective in what they finally did and drive the FARC to the negotiating table while under civilian control, democratic civilian control. So we worked very closely with Marta Lucia Ramirez, who was Minister of Defense, and learned a great deal from that in terms of what it will require for a military to be effective not just under democratic civilian control, but actually to do a job. In that case, driving the FARC to the negotiating table. And then the last thing, I had the very nice experience of knowing very closely the people who wrote Goldwater-Nichols, Defense Reorganization Act of 1986, which changed the top of our command structure. The motivation for that was that there were a number of failures, just tremendous failures, including 300 Marines that died in Beirut, problems with Desert One, et cetera, which motivated our Congress over the opposition of Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense, over the opposition of the military high command to change the command structure so that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would actually have some power, and that the line of control, President, Secretary of Defense, to the combatant commands was clarified. And it actually worked. It worked, and our first Gulf War, I think, was evidence that it was successful. Since then, why our civilians have gotten involved in Iraq and Afghanistan is beyond me, but that's another matter. So based upon all of this, my recognition is that most militaries basically are not prepared to actually fight wars with other countries. Thank goodness. Most of them do a whole series of different things, as in Portugal, or counterterrorism, military support to the police, et cetera. So I developed a framework based upon requirements, because to prove that militaries, or we work on intelligence as well, are effective or not is pretty much impossible. But what you can identify is whether they meet the requirements or not. And I must say, in most cases, and I by the way, I'm doing a course on Brazil right now. In most cases, it's uma lei para os ingleses ver, basically. There's no there there. There's no there there. But the requirements for me are for democratic civilian control to actually have some kind of a guideline, a framework, an organic law for the relations. Secondly, it is to have oversight, because look, I work for the military, and if you're not watching us, we do whatever we want to do. And the third is professional military education. And we can get back to that with Goldwater-Nichols and how they implemented that. That's very, very important. And on the other side, for effectiveness, it requires, first of all, a strategy, which most countries say they have a strategy, and they don't. Neither did mine until most recently. Otherwise, it's like Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So first of all, a strategy. Secondly, something like a joint high command, because with the emphasis in transitions to democratic civilian control through civilian-led ministries of defense, there's oftentimes, in all of my experience, there is a gap between what the Minister of Defense is doing and what the troops actually do. And it requires some kind of a high command to actually make things operational. And the Goldwater-Nichols experience for me was very, very important, because indeed it took a command role away from the services and made them basically recruiting, training, and equipping, and thereby providing to the combatant commands what they need to actually do the job. And then the last thing, strategy, a high command of some sort that is general and operational. The last thing is resources. This is the whole thing about uma lei para os ingleses ver, because if you don't have resources, if you don't have funds appropriate to what you say you're going to do, you don't do it, basically. So this is the case in Brazil. I write about this, so it's not as though I'm telling any secrets. So when, you could tell that if a country has a certain peacekeeping or humanitarian assistance, it doesn't take so much money as it does for counterterrorism and various other types of things. So this is a framework that basically I use. I think it's become more widely utilized. Aurore Croissant and I did a book that came out a year and a half ago It's called Civil Military Relations, Control and Effectiveness Across Regimes. And we deal with Russia and China, as well as the US and Chile and Germany and Tunisia and a few other countries. What I'm working on right now, and I must say that about 4 years ago at the EDN, I gave a presentation on this. I'm now working on the third element, that is democratic civilian control, effectiveness, and now outsourcing. Just for your information, half of the US Department of Defense budget is outsourced, which is to say it's contracted out. It's contracted out. And that has to have huge, we're pulling out of Afghanistan now, but there's still 13,000 contractors in Afghanistan. So this is a dimension of civil military relations that, what we say, it's the same with intelligence. Those who know don't say, and those that say don't know. That's the element here. So that's what I'm working on now. Okay, I think I've used up my time. I threw out a lot. I'll be happy to respond to any questions or queries or insults as you wish. Thank you for your time. And I very much appreciate the invite, by the way. Thank you, Elena. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. It was very interesting. I said that you wrote a lot of books, and few of them I used part of your information to learn a lot when I was a member of parliament. So the first time that I'm seeing you alive, you see, about a lot of things that you wrote in the past. And one of the main concerns that you put there, that half of the budget of the DoD is outsourced. It's impressive. We know that Afghanistan and Iraq was consuming most of that effort, but we will see now with the retreat from both of those theatrical of missions, what will happen next on how the resources are used by the DoD and how civil politicians and other means can control it, to see how effective those spending are used. Now I will give now the floor to our second finalist, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis. Is a professor at ISCTE. He have a master in historical study from Cambridge University and a PhD in war study from the King's College. He was from 2011 to 2017 a research fellow at the ESC University of Lisboa. He is an advisor of the IDN and an associated researcher at the Michael Howard Center for Military History at King's College. He is since 2017 an assistant professor at ISCTE. He's been a guest reader in a number of universities where he was taught courses of history of international relations, security studies, global relations and global governance, leadership and grand strategy. He was published in A Security Issue and Unconventional Conflicts, namely with Andrew Mumford, The Theory and the Practice of Irregular Warfare. So I will give the floor to Bruno. Thank you very much, because I admire a lot your work. I was telling Tom that I read a lot of things that you've been working on, but Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis is also for people that work on those fields as defense, security, and international relations. Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis in Portugal is one of the top on this field. So thank you very much, Bruno. The floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. You can use however you want. I remember, please, questions in the chat room. I'm waiting for those questions, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are hearing me okay. Thank you, Dr. João Rebelo. It's a pleasure. Thank you for your very nice words of introduction. I would like to salute my colleague in the panel. It's an honor. Thomas Bruno is a great scholar in the topic, as we all know. He's also has become a good friend through his travels to Portugal. We had very nice conversations over time. So it's a great privilege to be here with you and also with the other panelists. And of course, thank you, Elena, for putting this together, and congratulations to IDN. So on the topic of civil-military relations, basically I came to the topic through two ways. One is my own PhD research. I studied basically what we could call reforms, adaptation, transformation. How did the British, the French, the Portuguese military adapted or not, more successfully or less, to the challenge of counterinsurgency after 1945 in the context of decolonization, so the struggle against the anti-colonial independentist kind of guerrilla forces. The other one, a more recent one, is this paper I've been working on we could call it Civil Military Relations in Portugal and Brazil, the kind of the long-term historical view. I have, as you heard, I also have this background as an historian who's still very much present. Of course, Professor Nuno Sereno Teixeira is always a great reference for all of us as a pioneer in this field in Portugal, but so I was looking at military coups and pronunciamentos in Portugal and Brazil over the last century. But to focus more on the topic today, I'll try to make 3 points. Hopefully, if I have time, maybe 2, I don't know. One is changing, reforming any kind of institution, military or not, is always very difficult. No one gives up power, status easily, changes always affect that. The second one is that change and reform in the military does come under very special dispensation and under very special rules, which of course are intimately linked with this whole concept of civil-military relations, civilian control of the military. And thirdly, as I said, if I have time, very briefly, why do we need reforms and why should we be concerned with the fate of reforms? So the first one, it's very difficult to change institutions. This will always provoke a reaction. In this, the military is not different from civilian institutions. I think, yes, we should be attentive to the specificities of the military, of the armed forces, but also to the commonalities. And if you don't trust me, maybe you can trust Machiavelli in The Prince, and I'll quote, "There is nothing more difficult to handle, more doubtful of success, more dangerous to carry through than initiating changes. The innovator makes enemies of all of those who have prospered under the old order, and men are generally incredulous, never really trusting new things." So his basic point, well, first of all, is to show that there is nothing new here. We should expect a degree of conflict and tension when there is an attempt at change of an institution, at reform of an institution, especially at the level of the top leadership of that institution. But what this also shows is that there is this fundamental problem. We never really know how things will turn up in terms of the novelties, but it's very easy. So the people maybe that will benefit from the reforms, the changes, cannot be certain of that. And the people who are interested in maintaining the status quo, who to a certain degree identify with the status quo, who see their own status and power linked to that, have a strong incentive to oppose change. Of course, there are also valid reasons, and I wanted to underline this, for opposing reforms or change. Not every change is for the better, and certainly prudence is important. And certainly prudence is very important when we are dealing with the military, with the armed forces. But of course, there are also not so valid reasons, the ones that I've been alluding to, self-interest. There is a whole school that Thomas also knows very well, bureaucratic politics, that basically argues when dealing with this, where you sit is where you stand. So your position is determined by your situation in terms of what institution, what institutional affiliation, what institutional interests, budget are you linked to. So this is, of course, important. There are valid reasons. This is why it is worth having a debate and discussion like the one we are having. So the second point, and this is definitely the one where I'll spend most of the time, I think, has to do with the specificities of change in military institutions and the linkage here with the topic of today, civil-military relations. Of course, I think Thomas would also agree, one of the consensus in the literature, and of course it's never easy to find consensus in academic literature, is that the real test of subordination of the armed forces to legitimate civilian authority is not simply the absence of military coups. For a number of reasons, the absence of a coup can actually hide the fact that in an authoritarian regime, you have very effective control of the state by the military. They don't need to organize a coup, they are already in control. Or in democratic regimes, because it can simply hide the fact that civilian power is completely uninterested, uninvolved, even legally constrained in some way from getting involved more in military matters, meaning it doesn't really have effective authority or control. So that's why there is no tension, no conflict, much less military coup. And by the way, if you think that this is a good thing, maybe some in the military think, maybe, yeah, we could manage things better without civilians getting involved. Usually, and I think Thomas Bruno and his co-authors have shown this, for instance, in Latin America, usually this is linked with a lack of interest and also lack of investment in the armed forces. By the way, there is an interesting literature on how to avoid military coups, and actually I found some echoes of this in the debate in Portugal, this whole notion that you need to divide to rule, so you need different military forces, multiply the number of military chiefs because you need to balance them, and so as to make sure that they do not actually are able to organize, that they do not trust each other enough. They do not have a single chief that could organize an effective coup. I mean, there are studies about this in places like Syria or Pakistan, but I really don't think that this is very pertinent for our debate here in Portugal. So I think basically the main goal is to find this balance between two key, very important goals: maximum effectiveness of the armed forces through these reforms, and also a loyal, disciplined military serving the strategic goals set by duly elected civilian leadership. And I think, in fact, this is where the whole concept of, the strange concept, I would say, of governmentalization might come up. And this is where I have to say that I really have trouble translating the concept, not simply because I haven't found it in the literature. I don't know if Thomas, who also understands Portuguese, has found this discussion about governmentalization in a different context, but of course, we can translate it literally governmentalization. We can try to make it analytically useful. So maybe this idea that there would be an excessive party-driven interference by a specific government in the armed forces. And actually, this would be a bad thing. But we could find remedies for that. And in any case, the focus of the literature, and I think actually Thomas is a good kind of counterpoint to that, is to a certain degree a critic of that. Of course, he will say if that is the case, but Thomas has actually emphasized the point that the literature has focused almost obsessively exactly on the opposite point. The point is not we can have excessive control by the elected civilian government. The point is we need more control. This is the ultimate goal. Because we want consolidated democracies where the military is on the top of the military hierarchy. There can be no doubt that you have duly elected representatives of the people that set up those armed forces. So Thomas actually emphasized, and I think that also was clear in his comments, that you can take that a bit, you can take that too far. But I think everyone agrees, we agree that ultimately this is the bottom line. You need effective civilian control by the legitimately elected representatives of the people. What you need to avoid is to do that in a way that is detrimental to the effectiveness of the armed forces. But the idea that somehow government interference would be a bad thing is a bit odd in terms of the literature. Again, I could say that, well, maybe it could be a problem if, again, it was party driven by a specific government. But of course, there are remedies. What would be the remedies? For instance, the national defense law should not be a governmental decree. It should be a law, should be a special law with a supermajority of 2/3 of parliament. For instance, the government could not simply appoint as military chiefs whatever officers they would want. Of course, you can only appoint the most senior general officers, and the government needs the agreement of the President of the Republic, who's also directly elected by the people as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Again, I'm aware that this is the case in Portugal. So I fail to see exactly what the solution for this alleged problem of governmentalization would be. Governmentalization. Would it mean the return to some kind of military Soviet where the military would elect its own leaders? I think that would be a terrible idea, both in terms of the consolidation of democracy and also the effectiveness of the armed forces. Why is it so important to have this kind of basic principle about bottom line? And linking this with the challenge that Thomas Bruno has brought very pertinently of effectiveness. Wouldn't it be better to allow the military to come up with this perfectly effective deep reform of national defense and the armed forces? The problem is, and again, I don't know if Thomas agrees with this, I never found that. That would be paradise. We have such an obviously effective, so with guaranteed kind of effectiveness reform. One that not only is effective, but consensual. Everyone would agree, regardless of our interests, this is really what we need to do. If that is the criteria for reforming national defense, you will never do it. If you need to do all the reforms that might be necessary for a more effective armed forces, again, you will never do it because that's simply undoable. And again, based on some knowledge of military history, I never found any example of that. So reforms are always imperfect, to a certain degree uncertain in terms of their impact. It's good practice, in fact, to review previous reforms, and try to learn lessons, improve on those reforms, not to go too far. I would say that as a principle, it would not be a good idea for the effectiveness of the armed forces to have this overall holistic reform of national defense. You need to go maybe step by step. I think that would be the most prudent way. And ultimately, again, yes, maybe some of this will not go according to plan. Maybe some of the reforms are not the best in terms of effectiveness. But that's why we need to ensure that the right people make the decision. We can never be sure that we are making the right reform, but we can make sure that the right people, the people with the right legitimacy, are the ones ultimately responsible for the reform. Of course, this also requires, again, by law, that you properly consult the properly appointed military chiefs, the military council, the Supreme National Defense Council, where again, not only the military chiefs, but representatives of parliament, and also, of course, it's presided by the President of the Republic. And then, of course, you also needed to submit it to parliament. So there is a degree of mandatory consultation. And of course, I'm not saying, and I want to make this very clear, that I am in any way hostile to these reforms being debated. I think an open debate is very important. And of course, military officers, retired military officers, which are the ones who can speak freely without putting into question the discipline of the armed forces. Of course, they will feel concerned and they will feel involved, and they, of course, their ideas, their criticism deserves to be discussed. The basic red line and bottom line, and I think that in some cases, in some instances, in this current debate, that red line has been crossed, or at least it's questionable whether that is not the case. No military officer can claim to be, or no group of military officers can claim to be the spokesperson for the armed forces. This is an absolute red line in terms of a consolidated democracy, in terms of the discipline and the prestige of the armed forces. They have properly appointed chiefs who have expressed their views. So this is fundamental. Of course, military officers are entitled to their views, to express them, to debate them in public, but this is a crucial bottom line. I do agree, by the way, and I'm going to conclude in a couple of minutes. I do agree, by the way, that there is a point that is of some concern to me, which is the fact that perhaps not enough civilian commentators, civilian experts have been involved in this debate. So there are some military officers who say, no one cares about national defense. And I think that is a problem. in terms of proper scrutiny, of a proper debate. Again, for instance, we have Nuno Teixeira, that's important, but I think to a certain degree is a bit of the exception that confirms the rule. And this, I think, is a problem. We would need to do better there. Of course, it also does not help when sometimes military officers seem to claim that, you know, any civilian who dares comment on military affairs is almost by definition ignorant of military affairs. So if we want to have a kind of a more broadly spread national defense culture, truly national, we need to have much more civilian military dialogue and debate in, you know, as the rule. Last point, and I'll conclude with that. Why change? Why are reforms so important? Because, as we know, the enemy gets a vote and it rarely stays quiet, because the world keeps changing. Again, Professor Nuno Teixeira mentioned many of these trends. Because even allies keep changing, with which we need to continue to operate effectively. So if there is one big constant in the history of warfare, I would say it's change. If you want a stable, peaceful life, do not get into the armed forces. I think that should be obvious. The need for frequent adaptation is one of the things that makes military life, the military vocation, so demanding. So, and to conclude, no significant reform will be uncontested. No significant reform will get everything right. That's why we need reviews and new reforms. No military organization in history has survived, much less performed effectively, without the willingness to adapt, to continue to reform itself. And so my concern would not be with this specific reform and exactly how it will pass, if it will pass, but my concern would be if significant red lines in civilian military relations are crossed, this central principle that needs to be uncontested. Ultimately, the armed forces are subordinate to legitimately elected civilian authority. This is not an option. This is a fundamental cornerstone of a consolidated democracy. And also not just for reasons of legitimacy, even for reasons of strategy, of good strategy. We all know that strategy, and I think this is very much the strategic culture in Portugal, strategy, even military strategy, is about much more than the armed forces. The armed forces are an indispensable tool of national strategy, but we need to, the fundamental challenge of strategy, and I'll conclude with that, is to balance different vital goals, national interests in different areas with always limited resources. Of course, we are not a Gulf monarchy. Maybe they have unlimited resources, but that's again the exception that confirms the rule. And of course, in setting those goals, those strategic goals, you need civilian leadership. It cannot be done by the military alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. It was very interesting indeed. And I agree with a lot of things that you told. I have already a few questions. We have time. We have around 45 minutes. I don't have much questions, but I will use my prerogative maybe to kick off one. And that's for Tom, it's Bruno also. When I was a member of parliament, as I told you, I participated in two of the reforms that we made on the national defense law, which empowered chief of the armed forces with operational capabilities, like Nuno explained in the beginning of his presentation. The debate in the parliament needs to find a ground of support, because part of the law should have 2/3 of members of parliament. And that's one of our most strong means to be sure that the reform will be something that with most of the political forces agree. The second one is that we heard all the military chiefs before taking a decision. So it was a work with the government, and then the military chiefs went to the parliament to debate it. And finally, in Portugal, in our structure, the President of the Republic, which is directly elected, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which he have also his power. It means that government, parliament, and president have a balance powers to everything that is around defense and reforms on defense. But the question that I left for everyone of you is how the final process is really and truly something that is not already been prepared, and at the end of the day, it will be that what was in the mind of the government. That was all the time what I was debating with myself. And as you know, when I was in parliament, military chiefs asked me, well, you know, the reform is not good. And then the government said the reform is good. And then I was listening to people from the armed forces said, no, it's okay. So the political power that decided it in the parliament was all the time on a stress to respond to it, because as Bruno told, status quo on those issues is the middle name of any reform. It's better not to change than to change. And we know how hard it's to change the armed forces when they are being part of the political history since the beginning. They were created with our history. So we are debating very sensitive things. So first question is there, how really, truly, the reforms, when they appear, are not already almost finished, and that we have little time and little knowledge and ways to make a better debate. And I'm talking for Portugal, but Tom knows very well our situation. So, first question is from Américo Vitorino. Is for Nuno Severiano Teixeira, but it can be also for Tom and Bruno, because he's talking about things that are important. I'm going to read it. Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira, do you think the transformation in our armed forces may be little more than cosmetic until the contract regime is over, as long as the professionalization of the armed forces is not total and complete, as long as there is no active reserve regime in the acceptance of foreigners, and if we not assure the modernization and concentration of units, equipment, organic and infrastructure, and if the overwhelming weight of personnel costs remain at the present term, and if the state defense expenditure remains below 2%. So I think that question can go also for the three of us, the three of you. Then I have a second question from Helena Carreira. She using his prerogative is, nowadays there are concerns that certain countries, the military are getting involved in politics in ways not foreseen in democratic society. How do you see these trends? And then I have two more questions, but I will stop now and then I'll read the two of them. So the floor is yours. We can start with Nuno and then Tom and then Bruno, okay?
Okay, thank you, João. I have already responded privately to an Américo Vitorino, but I can say it openly. I hope that the transformation of the armed force will go beyond cosmetics. We never know, but I do hope that the transformation goes beyond cosmetics. Well, I agree with Américo Vitorino regarding the modernization, the need of the modernization and the optimization of the different means. And of course, this is a way, the optimization, this is a way of reducing the relative weight of personnel in the global budget of defense, of course, because we have a very unbalanced budget regarding the weight of personnel, which is too strong. So this is really a need. And I fully agree also with the question of reaching 2%. I have already expressed myself publicly, and I have already written publicly about this. And I think that the European countries, not only Portugal, but also the European countries, must make an effort trying to reach the 2% of military expenditure. So basically, I agree with the formulation of Américo Vitorino.
Tom?
Yeah. This is interesting for me because when I was communicating with Elena, I thought that that law from 2014 had been implemented in Portugal. So I reread what I'd written, and I think I sort of think like a Brazilian at times, and everything is conditional and subjunctive, so that I express things in a sort of a tentative way. I was thinking that in our experience in Colombia, when President Uribe said, well, our forces have to work jointly to deal with this problem of the FARC. And the response, the guy that I was traveling with is a retired two-star Air Force officer who used to fly B-52s carrying nuclear weapons and all that kind of thing. And he said, well, if the generals or the admirals don't comply or don't cooperate, fire them. Fire them. And this was, so finally a year or two later, President Uribe fired some of these guys that wouldn't cooperate. So this is one part of it. Another part is when our system, the Congress passed the Goldwater Nichols law, which was contested, an element of that was to get what's called joint professional military education. And all the training and educational institutions of the military didn't want to cooperate in this. So the guy, my friend Arch Barrett, who wrote this law on the House side, said, well, we have to put incentives there. And the incentive is, well, if you want to get promoted to colonel or general or Navy captain or rear admiral, you have to have this or you're never going to get promoted. And they implemented that because the Congress in the United States has approval or not. And they tracked this, and they basically would not promote anyone who had not done joint duty or joint education. So I guess the point that I want to get to is that one element is having the information, which might require some sort of a research capacity done by a government institution or a private institution. And then the way I think it works is basically control of the money, control of the money and control of promotions. That's at the end, I mean, it's sort of playing hardball, but if that's what's necessary, that's what's got to be done. If 2/3 of the parliament and the president signs it and this and that, well, that should be the law and it should be implemented. And it probably is going to take something like money and or promotions in order to do that. That's based upon the experience that I've learned from my colleagues who've been directly involved in all this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Bruno?
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very interesting questions and topics. So the first one, I mean, the level of military expenditure, the question of personnel, that also came up often in this debate. And these are very serious questions. But in my view, what is not serious is to say we cannot reform, for instance, the command structure. We cannot improve command structure in terms of greater jointness and all that until we have reached 2% or until we have solved the problems in terms of recruiting and retaining enough personnel for the armed forces. I mean, this is a European-wide challenge. We are actually, in terms of, for instance, military expenditure in percentage of GDP, so the effort that we make in terms of investing in defense, we are exactly in the median the medium level of NATO. So that's the average. It should be more. Yes, I think we should work towards 2%, of course. I think this is not just a magical number, but it does reflect what would be needed for a more effective, more operational armed forces capable of responding to the level of ambition that we have attributed to them, both in terms of support civil power in this growing trend for complex emergencies. We just saw the example of COVID. I think this was very important, tragic, but very important in reminding people that the armed forces are really universal insurance against all kinds of risks, the ones and threats, the ones that we can predict and some that we cannot predict, at least not precisely. So that's very important, but there is an effort being made. What is not serious, again, is to say we need to spend more on defense. And there is even this concept, which again, I failed to understand, which is pre-bankruptcy. So we are in the pre-bankruptcy. Well, we are all in pre-bankruptcy until we are bankrupt, I guess. So, but the question is there is an effort, and I think it's significant. It started with the government of Passos Coelho, which was, as you know, very much constrained by budgetary constraints. Already within the final years, he started reversing this trend and investing more on defense. It has continued with his governments, the socialist governments, which are not always seen as very keen on defense. So I think this is in part the result of pressure from allies, the US. It's partly the result of pressure from geopolitics, which has become much more threatening. So I think it's a fair question, but it's not fair to speak as if nothing is being done, or even have this idea that the government or the parliament is not investing in the armed force. I think that's not fair. In terms of personnel, the same thing. There's been actually Professor Helena Carreiras was responsible for this very in-depth study with all the relevant services in the National Defense Ministry, with the branches, in terms of evaluating the problems, finding solutions, concrete solutions, and then they are now being implemented by a group with that specific task. And it's very difficult because we live in this so-called post-heroic era, so it's difficult. So those are legitimate questions. We need to work more on that. But even this reform, in so much as it, for instance, focused the branches much more on recruiting, on training, it actually, I think, would help to a certain degree in addressing one of these problems, the problems of recruiting and retaining personnel, hopefully. So in terms of the question about the role of Parliament, this is a fascinating topic. I think one of the problems, but again, Dr. João Rebelo knows that much more than me, but I think, and this is actually an interesting ongoing debate also in terms of civil-military relations, Parliament is very important here. It should not be just a matter of government. And Parliament, to be effective in terms of control, but also contributing actively towards making the armed forces much more effective, it should have the tools for that. And it's very different if we are talking about the US Congress, where the Armed Forces Committee is extremely powerful, has a huge staff which is specialized in these topics, with access to classified information all the time. They can have real oversight. Of course, they also have to give their okay. They have to vote on the appointment of military chiefs as well as the budgets. So I think that's a problem in the Portuguese Parliament, unfortunately. It's cheap not to have that kind of support, and of course we can never reach the level of the United States. The Pentagon has 20,000 people, just the actual Pentagon. It's almost as much as we have in the entire armed forces. But I think we should have more there. Provide the MPs, the parliamentarians, with some additional staff to allow them to be much more effective. And of course, I understand the point. I think there has to be room for some accommodation here with other parties, which not simply the party of the government, and also with some of the suggestions of the military chiefs and the people who are now responsible for the armed forces. I think some compromise there is better than an ideal reform, because there needs to be a degree of ownership and consensus, both in terms of Parliament, which is in fact in the law, it's an absolute requirement, but also in terms of an ideal reform with which the actual military chiefs, the officers, the senior officers who are going to be in charge of implementing it are not identified, are strongly opposed, I think probably will not work very well. So it's not just a matter of seeking compromise for compromise sake. It's actually, I think, wise. The trick there is try to do it without annulling, the significant and the important changes that need to be done in terms of improving effectiveness. Just a telegraphic point to Elena's question about the military involvement in, I don't know if you were talking about Brazil or the United States, but I think, for instance, it's tricky when in Brazil, which is of course a country that we all love, family there, good friends, not just academics, but also in the military. I think it's tricky to have the Minister of Defense is a general officer. But again, you have the same in the United States, right? So I think that is a bit tricky. I think, to be fair, with the previous Minister of Defense in Brazil, he was always very careful in making sure and being very open that the armed forces were not going to be politicized. They would not, be on the side of the president against Congress or the president against the Supreme Court. So I think he actually had a positive role there, but I think it's tricky. And in the US, as you know, there was a debate, not about the qualifications of General Lloyd Austin, of the current Secretary of Defense, who is, seen as a very highly qualified, prestigious military officer, but with the fact that, again, we have a general officer as the defense secretary, as the Minister of Defense of the United States. And I think that's a fair discussion to have.
João, was I supposed to say something about this topic, if it relates to the US or not?
Yes, please, Tom, do.
Yeah, so you noticed last week that President Biden is getting our troops out of Afghanistan. Just like that. There's no question. So I think so much of this discussion and debate in the US about the politicization of the military is all about Trump. And that is just one of the many negative things about Trump and his experience. Now, and Risa Brooks, who I think is really very good on this, by the way, in terms of writing about it. I don't think much of these people who studied with Huntington, but Risa Brooks, I think, is very good, is trying to inject a comparative politics element to civil-military relations in the United States. Because like so much else in the US, it's this idea of exceptionalism. And the people who write about this, I don't think know anything about anywhere else in the world. So at the end of the day, as far as I can tell, this is much ado over nothing, in that before Austin could become Secretary of Defense, as his predecessor, Mathis, it required that the Congress would grant a waiver so that the person really was retired. And from all that I could tell since Austin took over, and now a big issue before, so much that was written up, was the lack of civilian control because it's all military. Well, with President Trump, he wouldn't let any of the, anyone but Trump people who are highly qualified assume those positions. And anyone that I knew who was fairly qualified didn't want anything to do with him anyway. So that it was a matter of basically fifth-rate people went into those positions. And now we see with the President Biden, there's, the best. I mean, the A team is moving into all of those positions right now. I mean, I work on intelligence as well. And this very dramatic report, you can get it online, that came out from the Center for Strategic and International Studies about the necessity for the total reform of intelligence, which we pay $80 billion a year on, by the way, for what it's worth. Well, one of the co-authors is now the Director of National Intelligence, and one of the subject matter experts is now the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So, I mean, these are highly qualified people that are typical who are moving in right now, so that they will be able to actually stand up and have a real civilian role in civil-military relations, whereas in the past, these were just a bunch of losers. And so it's no surprise that military, the nature of Mathis would basically rule the roost until, basically he had to leave because of Trump. But that's another issue. So that's my view on this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tom. We have 25 minutes more, and we have 3 more questions. The first one, I will ask you to, I will try to translate, in Portuguese, I will translate. It's a question more for the organizations, and it's from Maria Subtil, and she's asking, that's the debate, it's a very good initiative, but don't you think it's odd that the Parliament will discuss next week this reform, and only EDN is doing a debate 1 week prior to the debate in the Parliament? Why not try to bring more the civil society for that debate? So that's her first question. The second one, she is asking why there is no military in a debate, in a reserve or a retired military on this debate. So she's asking those 2 questions, and she believes also that the reform that is being debated in Portugal will be, at the end of the day, as a very small reform that will not go to the goals that it first start beginnings to be thinking of. Then I have another question to Thomas. It's for you, Tom, directly. And it's coming from, I'm not getting the name, I will try to find the name, Miguel Cavic, and he's asking, Tom, what are the critical issues of military education in democratic countries to maintain the hierarchical spirit while strictly respecting the law and the Constitution? I hope you understand the question. If not, I will try to resend. So it's directly for you. And then finally, I have another one to everyone, and we will finish with that, which is coming from Joana Lopes. Based on your research experience and in the previous experience of reform in the military and defense sector in Europe, do you believe that it is likely that some reform which were implemented with a focus on rationalization of expenditure can be reversed to reflect the evolution of the strategic priorities of the military at the European Union level? Second, in the light of the impact of Brexit, the need for the EU to articulate its involvement in mission overseas with NATO and the EU public opinion being favorable to an increase in defense budgetary investment, could more reforms in the military sector be in the horizon, recruitment of more personnel, training more and more equipment? That's the last questions that I have for both of you. Okay, thank you. Tom, you can be first if you want.
Okay, yeah. I think that second one is better for Bruno than it is for me. Just a couple of observations with regard to education for the military. So I've worked here at the Naval Postgraduate School, which belongs to the Navy, which belongs to the Department of Defense for 30 years. But I also have a son who is now a reserve Navy captain who just returned from 9 months in Saudi Arabia. So the 2 elements, it seems to me, for the education, and this is what we have tried to provide here for our junior officers. So one is the subject matter expertise, be it in engineering or in foreign area studies or these types of things. And the other is basically the kind of the discipline or the spirit that goes with basically being in the military. But let me just say that as a civilian, though, working for the Department of Defense, there is a whole series of things, the benefits are that what you do is policy relevant, you can get a clearance, but on the other side, you give up a whole series of, you can't talk about politics, basically. I mean, you can talk, but you can't, you can't lobby and that type of thing. And you can't accept money. You have to, because if you're doing anything with regard to military issues, you have to have a clearance anyway, because so much is secret or top secret or code word and all. And there's a whole series of things that you cannot do. So there's a trade-off, basically. And anyone who is in the military realizes that they have to give up something, but on the other hand, they then are able to, fly an airplane, jump out of a helicopter, shoot guns, or all of these types of things. And there's a code that goes with that. And I'm a cynical sort of person generally, as I think most academics are, hopefully. But it seems to me that the people who join the military, they buy into that code. They buy into it because they know in advance, we no longer have conscription, and very few countries do now. So anyone who becomes military, they become professional military. They know that they're getting something, but they're trading off something or other else in the process. And this is, you don't have to teach them because they know that. And it's just part of the whole ethos, which pervades some of the training part that they have to take at the beginning or somewhere along the way. And if they want to get promoted, and as everyone does, then they have to manifest this. They have to display these characteristics which are expected of them in every instance. So I don't see it as a big issue from what I could tell from my students or from my son.
Okay.
Yeah. You're mute.
Okay, thank you. Well, if I got one of the questions right, it was about the speakers, if I got that right. I don't know if Elena wants to address that, but I mean, I actually think one or two of the speakers are retired officers, but I don't think that's really part. I mean, the main question is they have expertise on the topic. I think that was the main criteria, I would guess. But so in terms of the question by Joana Lopes, I think if I understood correctly, one has to do with the problem of reversing, changing in light of this new, more contested geopolitical environment in which Russia is becoming much more assertive. I think that is already happening. I think it's not a coincidence that across Europe, across NATO, you saw this significant effort to invest more on defense from 2014 onwards. This was before Trump, and this is exactly the year when Russia, when President Putin decides to show that he's no longer bound by the traditional rules that after 1945 there were no changes in frontiers in Europe using force. So I think that was a major change, and it's already happening. Is it enough? What is the balance that you need? Because in my view, for instance, it's crucial, yes, to be attentive to Russia and attentive to, let's say, the conventional threat of Russia in the East, the more conventional threat. But it's also very crucial, and for us, Portugal, it's very relevant to say, Russia is also much more active in the Atlantic with naval capabilities, also with planes in the Atlantic. It's much more. Russia and China are much more active in Africa. Just a couple of days ago, the commander of AFRICOM, one of these joint combat commands that Tom was mentioning, the one created specific to deal with Africa, was mentioning, in Congress, that he was very concerned with the possibility, for instance, that China would set up a permanent naval base of some sort in the Atlantic, in the coastline of in the coastal state in Africa. So we need to be attentive to these kind of more conventional threats, but we also need not to be able to respond to security crises and security vacuums in places like, for instance, Africa or other areas. So I think that's very important. We need that kind of balance. And also, of course, we need much more, and this has been an increasing priority. It's one of the reasons why you have all these reforms and a much greater emphasis on jointness. It's the idea that you need an holistic approach. You need a multidimensional response. You need to take into account space. You need to take into account cyberspace much more. Commands are being created with those specific domains in mind. And they are needed for all the other traditional branches, let's say, to be effective operationally. So I think those transformations are taking place. It's always difficult. It's never as fast as you maybe would like. There are budgetary constraints, but that's again part of the game. I mean, I go back to this point about the Gulf states. You have to know, it's the fundamental principle of strategy from Clausewitz. You have to know what kind of conflict you are involved in, and you also have to know yourself and your enemy. That's even older, Sun Tzu. Portugal is not United Arab Emirates. We cannot simply say, yes, we now want a couple of billions of new fighter jets or a very sophisticated cyber defense or cyber attack capabilities. We cannot do that. That's not the kind. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of country we live in. So we have to adjust, but taking into account realities and the fact that, yes, again, the military tool is absolutely crucial. But as the military in Portugal knows very well, this is a tradition of Portuguese strategic culture. It's only one tool in dealing with security crisis. You need a number of others. It's only one tool in terms of a national grand strategy. You need a number of others. At the same time, and I will conclude with that, the good side of this is that I think increasingly European countries are willing to cooperate in this. They are investing jointly in capabilities. We just concluded this new CARD process, which basically identifies, through the European Defence Agency, identifies key gaps in capabilities, points to these capability gaps as priorities in terms of joint investment in this PESCO structure, the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defence. So I think, hopefully, in a few years, in the medium term, we will see some significant results, and we do need that. So I agree with that. European states need to invest in these new emerging technologies in the military if they want to stay relevant in the 21st century in terms of geopolitics, be a credible strategic actor. The myth of Europe as a peace, as a kind of a normative, peaceful actor, I think is really a myth. Thank you.
João, can I respond one thing to what you said before?
Yes, of course, of course.
See, yeah, when I was saying that $320 billion of the DoD annual budget is contracted out, I think you made some reference that after we leave Afghanistan, that might become available. Well, what we have transitioned from is this so-called global war on terror. Let's not get into whether that makes sense or not, to basically great power competition. So where the money's going to, the money's still going to be contracted out, but now it's going for, cyber. It's going for artificial intelligence. It's going for, basically in this country now, China is perceived as a real competitor, and the Chinese are very advanced in space and a whole bunch of other areas. So the money will still be contracted out, but it's going to Silicon Valley. It's going to Booz Allen. It's going to those, as opposed to the ones who provided the wherewithal for contingency operations. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, it's true. Thank you very much for that, Tom. We have 12 minutes. I have two questions that will be for both, and we will finish that. The first one, it's which are, in your view, the critical condition for the success of a defense reform? And it's coming from Professor Helena Carreira, and I'm interested to listen both of you about that also. And finally, from I'm begging to ask my partner, because I cannot read all the names because I don't know what is happening with my chat. Only appears Carlos something. He wrote, I couldn't agree more with Bruno. That is, in that matter, not for the government only, the Parliament must be permanently engaged and show its true colors on defense spending. Given how long it's been talked about with little headways, what is holding each country leadership back in Europe not spend more on defense? So that's the two last questions for both of us, both of you. Tom?
So, well, I mean, these deal with, basically Portuguese politics and Portuguese society. And I, as a foreigner, the one, for me, it's a matter of creating the institutions. And I was impressed with the parliamentary committee that deals with defense. And, it seems to me that basically they have to draw a line in the sand and say this has to be implemented, and they're the elected representatives, and it's up to them to follow through on it. It's easy said, and and I'm aware of it doesn't necessarily happen in that way here, but that for me as I said, when I was sort of surprised that this law from 2014 hadn't been implemented in Portugal. I would expect things not to be implemented in some other countries I know about, but in Portugal, I expected that this would come through. And then, in terms of the budget, I think that what Drona Ray said before, once there's a strategy, then it becomes one of the great things that Mathis did while he was Secretary of Defense was to get this national defense strategy out. And it really is a strategy. And, I could go into how, why I say that. But once there's a strategy, then it could make sense to members of parliament and to society why we have to contribute money to certain things and not other things. But without a strategy, or a very vague kind of strategy, it's very, very hard to convince anyone. And this is one reason why this kind of budgeting, for capabilities, to me, doesn't make any kind of sense, because it never convinces the people that control the money in parliaments or Congress that there's any need for this. There has to be some kind of a threat or some kind of an issue that the money could be understood to be supporting. And that might be a matter of reworking the Portugal strategy, which I think is pretty good, but making it a little bit more specific. That's about all I have to say on those.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, Bruno.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I think that in terms of how can we ensure success in a reform, I think it's some opposition is to be expected, so that you should not be alarmed with that. You need some kind of reformist coalition, including, of course, the top decision makers in terms of parliament, the president, the government. This is a requirement by law. I also think it's a good principle, and the reform needs to make some kind of sense. It needs to have some kind of narrative behind it that provides some kind of ammunition to those who are defending the change. But I think the key point here is always finding this kind of reformist coalition, and it must include military chiefs, because otherwise, they are ultimately the ones who are going to implement it. I also think it's fair to say, in terms of, for instance, the 2009 and 2014 reforms, I think they were trying to move in the right direction. I think there was some change. They were not completely not implemented. I think it's to a certain degree normal that if you are going through gradual, prudent reforms, and even in any kind of reform, it's normal that you don't get it entirely right at first. I think that's one of the things that we need to change in Portugal. We don't need to, we don't need perfection. That doesn't exist. We just need to point in the right direction. There's a great quote from Sir Michael Howard, who said, I'm tempted to declare that whatever is talking about doctrine, but you could say, what the command structure, whatever the armed forces are working on, they have got it wrong. I'm also tempted to declare that it does not matter. What does matter is their capacity to get it right quickly when the moment arrives. And what also matters is that we are pointing in the right direction and not the wrong one. So I think that's the basic principle. And it's normal that you need to review then implementation. And sometimes you need adjustment. So we should also admit that. In terms of more defense spending and how we get there, I think one important part of it is again public communication, and there I think parliamentarians, political leaders, opinion makers, they should be more active in terms of explaining why we need to invest in the armed forces in a sustained, responsible way. We are not going to spend 4% of the GDP because that would not be possible in a country like Portugal. But moving towards 2%, I think, is very important. I think that the tragedy of COVID helped to show that to a certain degree. I remember having these talks with friends, asking why should we have nuclear, biological, chemical capabilities in the armed forces? Are we going to fight a nuclear war? And I would say, you never know. There are biological threats sometimes. I was thinking about bioterrorism and all of that. The National Strategic Concept, actually of 2013, mentions there's a paragraph about pandemics, about public health. So again, I remember talking about with friends, why should we have an hospital for the armed forces? And I do think we should have one for the armed forces, a joint structure for health in the armed forces, even if they have specific, services sometimes for, underwater problems, health problems, or, high altitude problems. But you should think of them jointly. One of the reasons was we need a reserve. If there is a sudden catastrophe, civilian hospitals will be crowded. We need to have some kind of backup. Again, this was showed with COVID-19. So I think we have the elements of a narrative there. And I think we should do that. That's very important. Explain to people why are the armed forces important, not just in terms of forward defense, avoiding the creation of these sanctuaries for terrorists that then translate into attacks against Europeans overseas and even in Europe, but also these other dimensions of response to complex emergencies, of dual usage. Many of the technologies that we are developing for the armed forces in terms of space, in terms of cyber, in terms of artificial intelligence, they will be applicable in other areas. And Europe needs to play that kind of game if it wants to remain relevant, not just in terms of strategy, but also in terms of economics in the current century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruno says it all. It was and Tom also. Thank you very much for your intervention. We are right on time. I am quite optimistic that we need to do that reform now, the 2021 reform. It was in it will be the third stage. The first one, 2009, and then 13, and now 21. It's a continuous reform. I think, and now we are reaching the end. And I think the proposal that in the Parliament, it's a good one. That's my personal opinion, of course, but I think it should be seen as very important. Secondly, Bruno said, and Tom also said, how important the armed forces are when we are facing emergencies. And we are just right now try to finish one of them, the pandemic. And for just to finalize with some humor, because I don't know if Tom knows that, everyone in Portugal knows that the vaccination plan in Portugal start to work because we change for a military. It's an admiral from the Navy now that are ruling the vaccination process, and it starts to work well. Before that, our problems everywhere. So it's not, the military are not only needed because they, for the logical and the traditional missions, but because they are needed many times for all kind of other missions, like Bruno said. Before ending, I know the name of the people that put the question. It's Carlos Colasso. I ask forgiven for them, but now I know how to read all the names. Thank you for all the questions. There are other questions here. It will be impossible because the next panel will start in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Tom from California, for your wonderful intervention. It was very, very nice. And I see you for the first time, and I read so much about you, things that you read, that you write. So it's wonderful to put a face on things that I write, that I read, and that was so important to my work. And thank you very much, Bruno, again, for your excellent and brilliant presentation, as always. Elena, thank you very much for the invitation. Now, my last task is to say that we will have a 15 minutes break for the next panel. So thank you very much for everyone, and to Elena now. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Just to say thank you and see you all in 15 minutes. Bye-bye. So good afternoon, everybody. Let us restart our meeting. And it is with the great pleasure that I give the floor to Professor Ana Santos Pinto, who will chair this panel. Thank you, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Elena. Good afternoon to you all. It is my honor to introduce this second session of the seminar on reforming defense concepts and compared experiences. And I would like to start by congratulate National Defense Institute and in particular its director, Helena Carreiras, for organizing such a timely initiative. As Helena Carreiras has well recalled on the opening remarks, one of the main of the National Defense Institute's mission is to contribute and to promote Portuguese society understanding and the knowledge on security and defense issues. But also, as Helena well stressed, I think that the health of a democratic political community should also be measured by the existence of a broad and open debate on the development, the monitoring, the assessment of public policies, whatever they are, and the potential need to adjust these public policies to new contexts and societal change that are completely natural in any political community. Political change and structural reforms, what we are debating this afternoon, are not easy to explain to citizens, but also are not easy to explain to well-established institutions. And we well know that there are no one-fits-all model that can be applied to all contexts, to all societies. Furthermore, and recalling part of the debate in the previous session, literature, but especially experience, shows us that there is a significant difference in many cases between what is written in the law and the idea that bases the policy definition and its implementation. And here, the role of the so-called gatekeepers in the way that we apply them in political science, the role of these gatekeepers in each policy is very, very important. That is why we need consensus, that is why we need debate, that is why we need to promote ownership when we do political reforms and want to really implement them. And that is exactly why it is key to look to compared experiences and what we can learn with others that have been developing reform processes in defense policy, in defense structures, and in the governance of armed forces. And this is the main objective of this second panel. And I would like, of course, to thank the opportunity and invitation to share this session on the trends in reforming military high command, comparing experience, which has a panel comprised with renowned academic experts that I would like to salute and welcome to this seminar. As in the previous session, we will organize in two different moments. The first one with the presentation by each speaker, following the order that is identified in the program. First, Anthony King, second, Felix Arteaga, and finally, Olivier Zayek. And we should have around 15 minutes, since our three speakers, 15 minutes for each presentation. And the second moment for the debate with the audience, as well as happened in the first panel, for what I would like to ask to all interested to write the question in the chat in order that I can present it after to the panel. And I will briefly present each speaker before their presentation. So I will start by Anthony King, that is the chair of War Studies at the University of Warwick and recently completed a trilogy on Western military transformation in the 20th century, in the 21st century. The first book, The Transformation of Europe's Armed Forces of 2011, the second, The Combat Soldier on 2013, and last, The Command in 2019, which won the British Military Book of the Year Award in 2020. His new book, Urban Warfare in the 21st Century, will be published in July 2021 by Polity. In September, he will start a Laverium Major Research Fellowship in Urban Warfare, Past, Present, and Future, and he has advised the British Army and the Royal Marines for nearly 2 decades. Anthony King, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. I should just check you can hear me. Yeah, okay, that's great. So, look, just in preparing this talk, Helena Carreras suggested that what would be useful is to just provide a pretty simple history, a pretty simple overview of the British experience of this move to jointry, to the joint armed forces, a change structure. And so that's what I thought I would do, would be simply to provide you with a sort of 20-year history of this process in the UK, a little bit of a commentary on that. And then just in the conclusion, I would like to just slightly impertinently offer some thoughts in the application of the British experience to the Portuguese case. So let me start with that. And the talk will essentially comprise two main parts, where I'll talk about the changes, two periods of jointry that I think are observable in British military history, recent British military history, namely from 1998 to 2020, and then from 2020 to the present. The first period, a period of jointry, attempted jointry, and the second, which is just being initiated now, and a period of attempted integration. That's the new term in the United Kingdom. So let me start with this description. So let's think about the first period, 1998 is the decisive date here. Why 1998? Because in 1998, the new Labour government published a very important defence document called the Strategic Defence Review, which has been highly influential, indeed formative, for the last 2 decades in terms of British military forces. What did the Strategic Defence Review of 1998 propose? Well, essentially it identified the changing strategic context in which British forces were operating, namely the Cold War was over. The British forces were being increasingly employed for crisis management overseas. They'd done the Balkans, and of course Sierra Leone and Afghanistan and Iraq were over the horizon. So there was a transformation in strategic context. At the same time, organizationally, defense budgets and defense personnel were contracting quite rapidly, in fact, quite dramatically. You know, the famous Cold War dividend was being essentially cashed in. And so there was a significant contraction in budgets and personnel. And thirdly, of course, New Labour had come in on a landslide victory after over 15 years, after 18 years, 17 years out of power, and wanted to reconfigure defence and articulate a new vision for British defence and foreign policy. So these three elements came together, and you can see one of the key solutions which the Strategic Defence Review proposed in response to these three pressures, especially the strategic and the organisational pressures, was a move to jointry. And let me just quote you this very important sentence from that review in 1998. At the heart of the review is a series of initiatives across defence to coordinate the activities of the three services more closely, pooling and maximising their punch. And you can see very clearly the rationale for the move to jointry from the late 1990s in the UK. Now, what was the institutional basis? What was the institutional form this jointry took? It was not primarily a fusion at the strategic level. There was no attempt to turn the British Armed Forces into the US Marine Corps, where there is one Marine Corps, one strategy, one mission, one procurement program. The jointry that was proposed and was introduced in the late 90s in the UK operated at a slightly lower level, at a kind of operations level, a level of the way that operations would actually be done. And there were three key institutional innovations at that time. The first, and I think, and I would argue the most important, was the creation of a global operational joint headquarters, the so-called permanent joint headquarters based in Northwood, North London. And this had been established. It started to be established in 1994 and had become operational on the 1st of April 1996. And its existence and its importance was affirmed by the Strategic Defence Review of 1998. And indeed, by 1998, permanent joint headquarters had become an extremely important part of defence. Indeed, the first chief of joint operations, i.e. the head, the commander of the permanent joint headquarters, Vice Admiral Ian Garnett, said that it was the heart of UK defence capability. And he argued in an article published in that year, today neither they nor the MOD would be able to direct, deploy, sustain and recover a truly joint capability without PJHQ, without the permanent joint headquarters. So within 2 years of its establishment, and despite some very significant skepticism from the single services and from the MOD, the permanent joint headquarters established itself as a very significant, indeed an indispensable element of United Kingdom's military capacity and its joint capacity, its capacity to deliver joint operations globally. And indeed, by 1998, it had done 35 operations. Now, the most famous operation which Permanent Joint Headquarters did in this period was, of course, the 2000 operation to Sierra Leone, so-called Operation Palliser, where British forces, part of the reaction force, which I'll talk about in a second, were deployed in support of the Sierra Leone government against the attacks of the revolutionary United Front, Charles Taylor's, formerly linked to Charles Taylor's insurrectionists and guerrilla movements in Liberia. And the mission was a complete success, commanded from the UK by Permanent Joint Headquarters, genuinely joint, genuinely air, navy, army, and marine operation, which was hugely successful. So Permanent Joint Headquarters, as the kind of operational center, the operational command of British joint operations, was established late 1990s and proved to be indispensable. Second element was the Joint Rapid Reaction Force, which was the creation of a rapidly deployable reaction force consisting of elements of the three services: a maritime task group, some aircraft to support it, and essentially a amphibious and/or airborne battle group, which could be expanded up to a bigger force than that. And indeed, it was that force which the British used so successfully in Sierra Leone in 2000. The third element was perhaps less fascinating and less obviously military and useful, but actually was very important. It was the formation of a common centre for military doctrine. And this centre was established as a result of the Strategic Defence Review, called the Joint Doctrine and Concept Centre. It was established in 1998. It subsequently changed its name to the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre in 2006. But this centre became a very important means of uniting doctrine, i.e. methods, practices across the three services, and it's retained that importance since that time. So what you see by the end of the 1990s, certainly by 2000, is the formulation of a quite dense and coordinated joint structures within the British Armed Forces, a headquarters to command the operations from, a joint force to do them with, and a common joint doctrine to underpin the training and the tactics and procedures which the three services would do when they went on operations. Now, one of the interesting things about the initial success of this move to kind of operational jointery was it went into some reversal in 2006 to 9. So this is a sort of qualification of this period. 1998 to 2020, I think, is characterized by a common approach, a common joint approach to operations, an operational fusion of the three services. But just to note, 2006 to 2009 were a very difficult period for UK defence. UK became embroiled in both Basra and Helmand at the same time. It was totally overcommitted to both campaigns, and the results were pretty much disastrous for 3 years. And one interpretation we could put, it's a very complicated period in British defence history, but one factor here, which is interesting, was that the army, which was the primary force involved in both Basra, Iraq, and in Helmand, started to promote its own interests above those of Britain's strategic interests, and indeed of the other services. And we might say the crisis of 2006 to 9 was subsequently was substantially a result of a rejection by the army of its joint commitments and an attempt to institutionally forward its own interests, with terrible results in both Iraqi and Afghan theatres. But the general architecture of jointery was affirmed throughout this period and right up to 2020, 2021. Now, we have now just entered, I would argue, a second phase of jointery in the UK, a phase which we might call, and the armed forces do call, integration. The British government has just published two really important documents which dovetail, which bookend the Strategic Defence Review. The two important documents are the Integrated Review itself, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, which is the Security and Defence and Foreign Policy Review, the Integrated Review, and then the Ministry of Defence, the military's command paper, Defence in a Competitive Age, both published just 2 months ago in March 2001. And I think these mark a definitive rupture with the old joint system, and an attempt actually to deepen the levels of jointery, the levels of combined inter-service cooperation and coherence in this era. Now, what's interesting about moving to this new era is actually the strategic context, the strategic drivers, the strategic and organizational drivers are actually quite similar to those in 1998. Namely, we have a very significantly transformed strategic situation. The revision, the resurgence of peer state competitors, namely Russia and China. And so after 30 years of basically crisis management insurgency, we return to genuine strategic competition. This is obviously augmented by rapid technological innovation in disruptive technologies. And thirdly, very similar to 1998, despite the projected increase in defence spending, obviously the British Armed Forces are the smallest they've been in over 300 years. The army is only going to be 72,000 strong from 2025. So you have a very significant strategic and operational organizational pressure to reform the militaries, small militaries within tight budgets for what they're trying to do, very tight budgets for what they're trying to do in terms of technology. And of course, there's the fourth factor, just like New Labour in 1998, the Johnson government and Brexit have promoted the requirement to restate what the UK's defence commitments and its foreign policy and security commitments are. And the Integrated Review and the MOD command paper should be seen as a response to this transformed situation, externally strategic, but internal political and organisational ones. So what is the Integrated View and the Defence Command Paper, Defence in a Competitive Age, argue? Well, what they essentially argue is supposedly a deepening of jointery, into a phase where actually jointery, the cooperation between the three services, is superseded by a deeper cooperation defined by the word integration, that the services will be integrated. Now, integration means two things in the defence reviews. Firstly, it means that the military must be and will be, all three services must and will be integrated into other government departments. And it's very interesting, the Integrated View itself consciously nests the military inside development and also inside diplomacy. So defence is nested in security, it's invested in foreign policy much more widely. And all three departments, Ministry of Defence, development, its budget has actually been slashed quite badly after COVID, and the Foreign Office are the objects of the Integrated Review. So at one level, integration means deepening cross-governmental cooperation. But of course, it also has a very specific meaning in the defence sphere. to the armed forces themselves. And we can see this very clearly from looking at the Ministry of Defence's own Defence Command paper, Defence in a Competitive Age. And here's the crucial statement in that phrase, which echoes very closely that statement made in the Strategic Defence Review in 1998. And I'll read it to you. To succeed in the era of systemic competition, translation, near peer and peer state competition, to succeed in the era of systemic competition, we will need to be front-footed, integrated across all 5 domains: space, cyberspace, maritime, land and air. We will go beyond the traditional concept of joint to a depth of multi-domain integration that adds up to far more than the sum of its parts. So what integration means is a deepening of jointery, and it means it in 2 ways. One, that the armed forces, all the armed forces, will move together into the cyber and space domains, and second, they will also integrate in terms of their use and procurement of disruptive technologies. Now, the organization that's been set up to do this, so this echoes the setting up of Permanent Joint Headquarters in 1998, is an organization called UK Strategic Command. This command has existed from 2012. It was called UK Joint Command, but it has been empowered and given extra resources in order to fulfill this mission, i.e. to enable the United Kingdom to operate in cyber, to operate in space, and especially to design procurement and application of disruptive technologies for all 3 services together, so that the whole design and use of those new disruptive technologies, AI, robotics, autonomous system, quasi-autonomous systems, will be coordinated and led and commanded by the Strategic Command. And the aim is to create a force which is even more deeply integrated and more capable of operating across more domains out to 2040. Now, let me just come to a conclusion. First of all, just in terms of the UK experience, a skeptical conclusion. It's necessary, I think, for the armed forces certainly to move into space and to cyber and to start to take seriously the potential of disruptive technologies. But one of the ironies of the integrated review is actually, in some ways, it reverses the jointery of the period 1998 to 2020, because although there will be common procurement of cyber and cyber assets and capabilities and common procurements of disruptive technologies, actually the procurements for the single services drive them apart. So if you look at what's been procured for the single services under the integrated review, they are platforms that are strategic, single service strategic platforms, namely the Trident nuclear replacement, totally naval asset with a strategic mission. F-35 jets, totally strategic aircraft for the Air Force. And of course, the aircraft carriers themselves, which the Navy has procured. So and who's picked up the bill for this? It's the Army, which now is in a terrible state in terms of equipment and personnel. So what you get, ironically, in Britain is that the so-called integrated review, whose purpose is to deepen jointery, may actually, over the next 2 decades, have precisely the opposite effect on British forces and roll back the developments they made under the Strategic Defence Review of 1998. Let me just finish, absolutely, I'm just a couple of minutes over, so let me just finish very quickly with a quick minute on Portugal. So what's Portugal going to do? Well, what I would suggest is it's impractical for most European nations to genuinely create strategic jointery, to turn themselves into a US Marine Corps. The United Kingdom and indeed France have successfully done in the last 20 years is to create the capacity to do joint operations. And that seems to be the aspiration, and that seems to be a practical plan and aspiration which other European forces, other European ministries of defense might embrace. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Henry King, for your insights. I would like to highlight from your presentation that the process that you started in the United Kingdom in the 1990s with the first phase of joint structures and the second phase on integration, and all your presentation, at least in what concerns to my thoughts, raise a lot of questions that we certainly will have the opportunity to debate on the Q&A. And I would like to pass immediately to our second speaker, Félix Arteaga. Bienvenido, Félix, who is a senior analyst at Real Instituto Elcano and a lecturer at the Instituto Universitario General Gutiérrez Mellado. He has a doctorate in international relations, a bachelor degree in political science from Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and a degree in law from UNED. Félix Arteaga is an officer in the Spanish Armed Forces in reserve and holds a diploma in national security management from Washington National Defense University. He has an extensive teaching and analysis experience, and between 1999 and 2001, he directed the European Commission Security Sector Reform Program in Paraguay. Félix, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Muito obrigado, Ana. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to my friends of the Institute of National Defense, Lisboa. Let us start by saying that every national military reform is very difficult to be exported, even within the small Iberian Peninsula, because every country has many politics, structural problems, which are really very difficult to be taken into account. So I prefer, but I think that it's more useful to learn about the difficulties, the obstacles, the failures that other military reforms have taken place. And that's what I'm going to describe, the problems we have been facing since we started to change the military chain of command 4 decades ago, more or less. First of all, this is a political issue. I understand the technicalities, but this is a political issue. In Spain, changes were related to the democratic transition, but the political parties understood the need to adopt reforms in order to move the chain of command from 3 different headquarters to a single command within the Ministry of Defense, and from the organic traditional services to a single operational command. This is the basic of our story, of our history. These changes are sensitive, and that is why, for instance, in Spain, any potential reform of the military structure is elaborated under an organic law, which is the kind of law with more protection in order to avoid interference or controversies between the policymakers and the military servants. So even for terms also matter. For instance, our military chief was not chief of the armed forces, but chief of the defense staff, and the joint operational command has replaced the whole number of armed forces staff. So everything is linked in this area. We have obtained mixed results. On the one hand, we have achieved good, reasonable centralization in the operational field. There is a single operational command with different sub-commands for cyber, special operations, international operations, and so forth, and everything related to operation in the long sense, they are under the control of the Chief of Defense Staff. But we also have preserved some kind of autonomy, operational autonomy, to the different services. They retain a point of contact between the operational command and the organic system in order to sustain the fiction that they have missions, that they have operational functions to accomplish. This is the result of a balanced approach, trying to preserve both the autonomy, or at least the fiction of autonomy for the different services, and at the same time trying to promote decentralization under the Chief of Defense Staff. We have also a very limited role for the international mission, the international headquarters, and units for the different services. All these international units, initiatives, programs, and so forth, operation under the control of the Chief of Defense Staff. This is a big advance with regard to the previous situation, because everything related to the power projection is under the field of the Chief of Defense Staff. NATO, European Union, bilateral agreement, everything in this field belongs to the Chief of Defense Staff. And also a problem with this evolution is that the government, any government, gave or tried to get Chief of Defense Staff with strong powers in order to sustain the balance between the services and the operational command. Our governments do not want a strong military or in order to avoid this kind of challenge between civilian and military. They prefer to have 4 different militaries in order to divide and win if there is any military demand. So we have faced old battles and new battles. About old battles, one is about money. We have passed from fixed shares of the budget for the Army, Navy, and the Air Force to a more balanced with shares for those armies, but some priorities for the new actors like the operational commander or the Ministry of Defense and so forth. But this is a long-standing battle for the money. Also for the missions. The missions in the past belonged to the different services. Now there are no longer land, maritime, or air missions. We have international or national missions under the command of the Chief of Defense Staff and the operational commander. And this this operational influence is moving from the different headquarters to the headquarters of the Chief of Defense. And this, along this period, not very simple, not very easy. In the same package, the control of the operation, the doctrine, the military standards have been moving from the different headquarters to the central command. In this way, the services only control personnel training and basic training, but not the rest of operational functioning. Then we have a problem with the organic and the operational subordination. Every man, women in uniform are dependent from the different services under the organic system, but under the Chief of Defense and the operational chain of command. And this creates serious trouble. First, among the chiefs, because they try to gain ground to influence the outcome. They try to gain more influence with the ministers of defense, with the prime ministers. They try to represent not the full spectrum of our forces, but the very land, maritime, or force requirement. And this is also a problem because from time to time, they bypass the Chief of Defense in order to express claims or act for reforms or to influence the decisions of the ministers and the prime minister as well. But also, not only the chief, but also the people serving in the defense staff, because when they go there to this operational command, they are thinking that sooner or later they will return to the service and they will be asked what they have been doing for the service along these years in the operational command on the defense staff. And this is a major problem because, for instance, the capacity for planning, the manning for the staff is lower at the joint command than at the services. And this is a real problem for planning purposes. What is the name for my service now is the problem because we have divided this dependency. And we are going to face also battles in the future. Anthony mentioned some battles before, but first, the battle about the money expenditures is going to increase if the economic recovery doesn't take place very soon. The situation, the place that the defense expenditures occupy in the agenda is decreasing, and this is going to exacerbate the problems between the different services. So we have another problem about transformation. Transformation is a topic for the Chief of Defense Staff. In Spain, he has a transformation unit, and he is always trying to transform the services, transform the joint force. Transformation is a responsibility, and he is or she is accountable for this transformation. But this is a lost battle because every time the Chief of Defense Staff tries to restructure or to transform, not in a radical way, but in a very adaptive way, the structure, the posture of the armed forces, the chief of every single services always try to influence the press and the local authorities and the prime minister, the minister, whatever they are able to do. So this generates, in addition to the transformational stress in the army, in the services, this generates political stress. And every very transformative intent is condemned to this kind of competition. Now we are, another thing, responsibility of the Chief of Defense is the military planning. And here again, the different services try to develop their own visions of the naval structure, the Air Force, space, deployment. All they have their own views, their own relation with the industries, and they present their own planning to the different ministries, to the prime minister, and it is very difficult for the Chief of Defense Staff to control this proliferation of military planning, visions, and structures and demands. So this is a real problem, and especially if, as I have said before, the Chief of Defense have less planning resources than the military one. So another question is about the new domains. Anthony mentioned the path from the jointness to the new multi-domain efforts and so forth. Now what we are seeing in Madrid, in Spain, is that every service is trying to create its own multi-domain, air, naval, cyber domain, maritime, space, underground domain. So they are creating, as we don't have any kind of single military strategy or the same command plan that you mentioned in the integrated review, we are open to this kind of demands. And finally, and I agree with you, all these services are more interested in legacy equipment than in disruptive and new technologies. And they are always trying to protect big platforms because the personnel, the money, the budget they receive, and the influence they gain is based on this legacy equipment. Summing up, to give the floor to questions and answers. This is jointness is a never-ending story. It's very difficult, at least in Spain. We don't have that kind of professional culture looking for the joint interest of the armed forces. Corps have a lot of influence in the process, and we have made legal and political advances, but the implementation, the supervision of the measures we have adopted is very limited and very sensitive. I'll finish here. Anna, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix, for your contribution. For who is hearing you, it's very clear and pragmatic exactly what you said. And the little knowledge that I have from this context, I completely see in your presentation the domains and the problems that we are facing also in Portugal. They are very similar. And in the Q&A, I hope that we can hear you about your analysis on how to surpass this never-ending story that I completely agree with you. And without further delay, I will pass the words to our last speaker in the panel, that is Olivier Zayek, who is lecturer in political science and international relations at University Jean Moulin Lyon 3, and agrégé and doctor in History of International Relations in Paris 4 Sorbonne. He's graduate of the Special Military School of Saint-Cyr and Sciences Po Paris, and he has been head of geopolitics course at École de Guerre in Paris since 2015, among many other research and teaching activities, and in addition of regularly contributing to various defense and international relations publication. Olivier Zayek, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your invitation first. It is really an honor to be here at IDN to discuss about defense reforms with distinguished colleagues and experts. So bom dia a todos. I'm not sure that my Portuguese accent is so brilliant, but I must confess that I'm not sure either that my English accent is more brilliant. So sorry for that. Concerning the analysis of the French experience, because we talk here about defense reform, my first point perhaps would be that the joint culture, jointness or jointery is no more a question in the French armed forces. This does not imply to me that corporatist, bloody games have ceased between the different branches, particularly at a budgetary level. This is why the word joint is perhaps a trap, because I think that it must be appreciated in a precise, very precise context and judged according to the objects of which it is applied, especially in a compared approach between very different countries. And I'm really in line with the comments on this point from the preceding panelist. So in France, jointness covers a series of developments which are rooted in the beginning of the 1990s, like in England, in the United Kingdom, of course. But those developments really took shape at the institutional, doctrinal, and operational levels during the following decade. In reality, given the limited time available, I will deal here in order to contextualize this quandary, first with the institutional point of view, and then with the operational one, because they are quite different in France when it comes to jointness. So as far as the institutional aspect is concerned, when the reforms that were supposed to lead to the reinforcement of joint command and decision-making structures in the French armed forces begin, the essential question was the place of the chief of the joint staff, in French, le chef d'état-major des armées. His function was clear, very clear at the operational level, but his real power politically and institutionally was relatively limited in the peacetime military structures. In the remarkable study devoted by Bastien Hirondelle to the sociology of the reform of the armed forces after the Cold War, we can read, for example, this statement by an anonymous French chief of staff taken from an interview with the author. I quote this anonymous chief of staff. We are in the middle 90s. As a chief of staff, if the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff comes to see me in my office to say, I am taking away so many billions to give them to X, I will slit his throat in my office. That's really interesting because here, beyond the provocation, we witness the feelings of those, then powerful chiefs of staff who sincerely consider themselves guarantor of the coherence of the armed forces for which they are responsible. For many of them at this time, pushing the joint process too far meant weakening not only the capabilities of the armed forces, but also the coherence of their command and the specific culture that constituted them. In other words, their cohesion. So capabilities, coherence, cohesion. At the institutional level, what I personally label as the 3 Cs summarize the joint equation. And that was not only a problem of relative power of individual decision makers in the military process. The problem is that precisely during those years, jointness is conducted within the general framework of a permanent reduction of the armed forces budget. And along this period in France, which extends roughly from 2000 to 2015, defense is considered as an adjustment variable of the general state budget. Whatever the political orientations of successive French governments may be. So this deflationary context gives the joint process a very managerial character in the wrong sense of this word. And from a bureaucratic point of view, the military are marginalized in this decision process. The key words of this period are mutualization, outsourcing, professionalization, and they are used by the Ministry of Defense to move the forces, and I quote the Ministry of Defense at this time, from an armed forces culture to a corporate culture. And it's not really comfortable for the chiefs of staff. And this whole evolution is based in particular on the observation of the British so-called model at this time, which is considered in France as more agile, more adapted to the new strategic context, especially in the projection era. But the problem is that this model, what is considered as model at this time in France, led to shortcomings that weaken the effectiveness of armed forces, particularly in the area of support. I have no time to specify this, but in particular in the outsourcing process, the private-public partnerships that went too far. That went too far in the French armed forces. So that was really considered as very negative from the point of view of some military decision makers. After 2015, that is after the terrorist attacks in Paris, all this context brutally changed. And drawing lessons from this period and putting more emphasis on the concept of strategic autonomy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, without questioning the joint process, firmly advocate a capability balance between military effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And in the context of growing geopolitical threats, this argument is being heard by French political decision makers, both in terms of budget and capabilities, especially after 2015. And this is why now, after some really fierce battles and problems between civilian and military leaders and decision makers in the world process, now at the institutional level, the joint process eventually moved away from a strict deflationary managerial orthodoxy. It tends now to preserve the organic and capability coherence of each armed, or each branch or each service. And at the very beginning of this process, we can say that in France, joint rationalization had taken a more economic than a strategic direction. But now this aspect, this unbalanced aspect now seems to have been corrected in France. And the chiefs of staff, Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and Air and Space Force are very happy with this new balance. So the point is that whatever the difficulties and paradoxes of this period at the institutional level, from a jointness point of view, the military never really questioned this process. And now it is really important to understand why. And it is now, it is not due to the institutional process and its internal logic. It is really due to operations. It is really due to the operational efficiency and credibility that is given by a more integrated, more joint armed forces in France. And it is the second aspect, the operational aspect of this jointery, of this jointness that was really deeply, that was really deepened in France for more than 20 years. So at the operational level, the joint reform that eventually led to the organization of the current high command is rooted in President Chirac's decision to move from a conscript armed forces to a truly professional structure. Yes, that was due to internal, very political considerations. It partly explains this decision, but that was not only that. And this decision, in fact, in France, does not only concern a military model, that is the mode of recruitment of soldiers, but more broadly, the overall efficiency of the defense tool as a whole, as implied in the presidential speech of February 1996. I quote this, that is President Chirac speaking at this time. Our defense tool today is completely inadequate and cannot really and effectively ensure the missions that should be its own. So I am, as the chief of the armed forces, I am carrying out a reform that will lead France to have a professional military force. So it is here the criterion of efficiency and credibility that is concerned. And it is this criterion that unavoidably led to a profound reform of the high command. And the issue here is that this operational evolution stems directly from the lessons learned by the French generals during the First Gulf War. It is not at all rooted in the Coin era, the counterinsurgency, or the projection era. Not at all. Those lessons really come from the First Gulf War, in which the French committed 10,000 men in the Daguet division. The American performance was closely observed, in particular the way in which the airline battle doctrine used the concept of reconnaissance strike, for example. And the French staff noted the effectiveness that a perfectly integrated high command could produce at the operative level, especially. The French also noted that the systematic use of tactical data links not only enabled communication, but also generated a shared vision of the situation and achieved a better interweaving of friendly resources in the same combat space. So this joint combination, the full potential of which was seen during Desert Storm, led to several developments on the French side, starting in the middle of the 90s. So far before the coin era linked to 9/11. That was first the creation of a joint entity for planning and conducting operations, which is now labeled as the CPCO. So the translation could be the Planning and Conducting Center for Joint Operations. It is now really the center of the joint military operations in France, of all operations, in fact. The second realization was the implementation of a joint training cycle to prepare for any major operations and to facilitate maneuver between the Air Force and the Army in particular. The third point was the use of mobile, reliable communication capabilities, interoperable with our allies' systems, while, because we are in France, preserving the independence, of course, of French national military decision-making. So during the last decade, new strategic challenges linked to the evolution of conflicts were taken into account by the High Command, and it deepened the engagement of High Command in the joint process. And to sum up, it is precisely the necessity to cope with those operational challenges, much more than bureaucratic rationalization driven by civilian decision makers, that really accelerated the reform of the High Command, leading to an what we could label as an ever greater power and centrality of the Chief of the Joint Staff over the different Chief of Staffs of the armed forces. So over the past 25 years, like our British friends and allies, through various operations that have served as testing grounds, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, and so on, this objective of combination has evolved towards an ideal of integration, before recently finding itself confronting with the horizon of fusion. So combination, integration, fusion, that is to say, a real acceleration of this jointness pace in the French armed forces. We have here, in a certain way, the culmination of a gradual blurring of the boundaries separating each specific branch, made possible by the rise of control as a central strategic function, which has been completely transformed by an ever-increasing digital fluidity. So in order to conclude, I have insisted on these operational aspects to underline why, despite some, I would say, controversial decisions, sometimes linked to the jointness, from an institutional point of view, from a procurement point of view, from also the very difficult point of view of civilian military relations in France. The French High Command has continuously bet on integration from 1991 to those days, to 2021, quite simply because the French generals who have always been involved in major military operations in and outside Europe over the past 30 years, saw this as a clear improvement in terms of credibility and operational effectiveness, be it at a national or multinational level. Thus, it explains the central position now of the CPCO, the Joint Center for Planning and Conducting Operation, and that is widely accepted. I would add that as a professor of strategy at the French Joint War College for more than 10 years, I can witness that from all officers coming from the different branches serving in this structure, the CPCO, is a must. That's the real plus in terms of career. You can't access the high responsibilities in the high command without having a real joint competency, a real joint experience, and without being a seasoned joint decision maker in the military process. So it is really central in the French armed forces now. And I would add, perhaps my last words, that the current adaptation of multi-domain thinking to the operations design and the evolution of command and control, especially with the integration of artificial intelligence in the years coming, will, in my opinion, only confirm this trend towards joint integration of the French High Command. There will be no U-turn in the other direction. That is to say that the multi-domain doctrine only reinforces the trend towards jointness. It doesn't weaken it in France because it is all it points only on the criterion of operational effectivity. So jointness is now considered as the future for the French High Command. It's not a controversial issue at all from this point of view, at least. Sorry for having been so long, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olivier Zayek, for your presentation and all the information, for highlighting in the French case the importance of the operational aspect, and also the importance that international missions had on transforming the idea that all the hierarchy, but particularly in the high rank, have in the question that I think it's very interesting regarding the increasing of credibility, but also to promoting a joint doctrine, and the trend that, as you well explained, is more to maintain that to reverse on a U trend. And after this so enlightening presentations, we will start our question and answers, our debate period with all the participants, and I will reinforce my appeal to put your questions in English, please, on the chat. And I will have here already a question from Helena Carreiras, but if you allow me, I would like to use this prerogative of being in the chair of this panel to ask something that for me it's not clear, and I would like to ask to the three of you. What do you think should be the relation between strategical review, the analysis of the context, and the needs of the country from its armed forces and the missions that are defined and are a responsibility from the political sphere? What should be the relation between the strategic review and this structure and governance reform? It's like the key, the egg and galinha, the chicken. Who comes first? The strategic review, or we should adapt the reform structure and the governance structure to the context more than putting them in the grills of this strategic review and using mainly the model of the United Kingdom. And I'm going to put this question with the question that Helena Carreiras raised, that is how important it was and it is the role of public opinion in the reform processes in your countries. Is the public opinion irrelevant or accounted for? There is any expression of this public opinion in the public sphere and how it's related with the political and institutional process? And then a series of other questions. Thank you very much.
Who's going to go first?
I don't know.
I'm sorry. We use the same model in the panel. First, Anthony King, then
Okay.
Felix Arteaga, and last, Olivier, please.
Okay, well, sorry, Olivier, to put you last, but thanks for your very interesting talk. Yeah, the first question, Anna's question. I mean, this is a tough one. Yeah, tricky to say. I mean, the relationship should be causal from review to changing structures. It should be, but of course, two things which I think is interesting about listening to Olivier is, of course, you know, actually what actually really drives a lot of this stuff is the operational pressures, contingent, immediate operational pressures, which the armed forces themselves feel. That's where if they feel they're going to fail on an immediate or upcoming operation, that starts to make senior generals think quite hard about what they're up to. So there's a sort of material pressure, you know, it's the sort of bottom line, the equivalent of a corporate bottom line. The operational pressure drives it. So what I'd suggest is actually, it's not so much that, I would say it's not so much the reform, you know, the sort of internal reforms sort of drive the structural review, but the operational pressures. However, it's multidimensional. So in the UK, why did the UK go early to a kind of a joint structure at this sort of operational level, at the level of operations? Well, they'd already had quite a lot of experience of joint operations, you know, right back to the Second World War with what used to be called combined operations. They had two very important brigades, an airborne brigade and an amphibious brigade, which were linked in completely to the Air Force. In the Falklands in 1992, it's a joint operation. So you've already got a force that, because of its military history, its imperial history, and then its history in the 20th century, was already tuned up to that. But then I would say operational pressures trump everything. And the other thing below that is, of course, money. When forces start to run out of money, they start to look around for what to do. And then what you start to get is a very complicated political process, and actually quite arbitrary but interesting political process of the services and various other political factions getting in on the game. And that's, so what you'd like to see is someone writes a rational plan, a review, it gets implemented. It's a bit more muddy and complicated than that. In terms of public opinion, to the move to jointery, the armed forces in the UK, and I think let me put this in France as well, are much less controversial than countries in Europe that have recently experienced authoritarianism, namely Portugal, or when I say recently, in the remembered past, Portugal, Spain, and potentially, I mean, Italy's a bit more of a stretch, but so the armed forces are much less controversial in the UK, unless you're a Republican Catholic in Northern Ireland, than they are for the most of the British population. And therefore, frankly, I don't think the British population gave one iota, one damn about the move to jointery. They just wanted armed forces which were efficient and effective. So I can't remember any controversy about the issue of jointery. The only time that jointery has come into some controversial areas is where it's then implied a cut to certain bits of the armed forces. So for instance, a regiment gets cut out of the army and a base gets abandoned in a town in the Midlands in England or in Scotland. That then becomes a political issue. Or ships stop being built in Southampton or Portsmouth or Glasgow, etc. But the actual issue, it's not political in the same way that I think it probably still is in Portugal and Spain, with that historical association between the armed forces and the state in an oppressive way. But that, as I say, I think is a British experience.
Thank you, Anna.
Anthony. Felix?
Yes, I'll start by the second question about the public opinion, which is the influence. No? Every country has its own strategic culture. In my view, strategic culture is not about what public opinion people, ordinary people, thinks about the military. No. Strategic culture is about what decision makers, politicians know and do about the defense. And that is what we haven't here. Most of our policymakers and our politicians only see problems when dealing with military affairs, and they try to avoid any kind of controversy or political cost in the process. And that explains why, first, the civilian influence in the planning process, both at the Ministry of Defense, also at the Chief of Defense Staff, is very limited. So every national document, directive, doctrine, transformation, planning is bottom up from the military without any top-down political guideline with transformational intention. So at the end of the process, the military decide what is to be done. And in this way, everything is, I want to say, happy or easy. The military are happy because they have what they want. The politicians are happy because they don't have any problem with the transformation. And the rest of the public opinion is calm because they believe that our army is adapting to the strategic context that they need. So only a few analysts and not very influential scholars are dealing with this concern. Thank you.
Olivier, please.
Yes, I hope that you hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah?
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, because due to coronavirus laws here, I must quit my desk in the university and so resettle in another place. So sorry for this. For the first question, when it comes to the link between the review, a strategic review on the one hand, and the defense reform process on the other hand, I would say that in France, that's not really the question. In fact, the real question is the link between the strategic review, what we call the white paper on defense here, and the capabilities that you give to your armed forces to fulfill their missions inside and outside the territory. And from this point of view, during more than 20 years, that was not exactly the case. You have a triangulation between the declaratory strategy, the strategy of means, which is the capability strategy, and what we call here the operational strategy, that is the ability of our armed forces really to be efficient and to gain the decision in the given theater. So declaratory strategy, capability strategy, and operational strategy. And for more than 20 years in France, because of this, deflationary context that I tried to describe in my communication, the declaratory strategy that is very French, in fact, was really high, really ambitious, but the capability strategy and the operational strategy were not really linked with this, with the first dimension. So you had, a white paper on defense in 2008, in 2013, and they were not really linked with the reality of what the Ministry of Defense, what armed forces were at this time. But now I would say that this gap between the declaratory strategy, especially in the new review of 2017, that was refreshed this year, this gap is reduced. There is really an effort to link what the strategic review is for and what the armed forces are, what they need, and what they must be at the operational level and at the strategic level. So I would say that as for now, the situation is far more, is better than in the previous years in France. This gap is really reduced. That's good. That's not perfect, far from it, but it's good. As for the public opinion problem, the political decision makers in France, as for now, have a problem, because the military, the generals, the military in itself in France, they are really appreciated, with the return of this authority, of this, in the general context of disorders in the society, in general context of fear and mixed expectation about the future of Europe, the future of France, the future of our societies in the developed world. The military appears as something really, strong, really stable, really, and so on. So the military decision makers are really appreciated, in the different polls in France. You can see that the armed forces are at the top, with the teachers, with the personals in the hospitals and so on. They are really at the top of the consideration of French citizens. So when it comes to controversy between the political decision makers and military decision makers from a budgetary point of view, when it comes to capabilities that have to be given or authorized in favor of the armed forces, generally speaking, the public opinion is in favor of the arguments that are put by the generals on the debate, the public debate. So the political decision makers have to take this into account, but at the same time, it is not really a tradition in what I would call the new culture of French officers or French high military decision makers to really go into controversy through the public opinion, through media. They prefer really to deal directly with the political level. And it is also why the president of the French Republic is the chief of armed forces. And it is a direct link between, for example, Mr. Macron and the chief of the joint staff. They are really closely linked. There is a direct link between them. And the Ministry of Defense is somehow not put on the side, but when the chief of the joint staff wants something, when he considers that the armed forces have not the capabilities to fulfill their missions, especially in the operational engagement, for example, in Africa, there is this, this special link with the president of the republic that can reorient the decisions and the procurement and so on. And perhaps it is a criterion that helps to smooth the process. And there is no real need for controversy before in front of the public opinion. And I would say that, especially at this time, that's my last word. That in 2017, the chief of the joint staff was fired by Mr. Macron. That was really brutal. That was really a shock in the French opinion. This General de Villiers, is now considered as a possible, perhaps, contender in the French presidential election. So by some people, I don't believe in this scenario. I must confess, for some reasons, I don't believe in it at all. But still, there is a question. There is something here. So it is, and due to the audience that military decision makers, that military chiefs have in the French opinion, as for now, it could become a real political question. So neither the French generals nor the French political decision makers really need or want controversies on those questions. And the direct link between the President of the Republic and the Joint Chief of Staff is here to smooth those controversies, I would say. So public opinion is important, but it is not a tool that military decision makers really voluntarily use to go on clash with the political masters.
Thank you very much. We are in our last minutes of the session, but I cannot do the questions that Bruno Cardoso Reis has raised, one for each of you, and I would like to ask you to answer to each question. I will start by the question directed to Felix Arteaga. What is your view of the relationship between the SHOD and the departments of the Ministry of Defense? Could a more joint planning and capabilities development be designed? To Olivier, Bruno asks, what is the current role of the chiefs of staff of the branches, services in France? Does promotion system in France work to promote the primacy of jointness? And last but not least, the question directed to Anthony King. What are the implications of this new reform of CHOD and permanent joint headquarters? Is it significant that the Chief Strategic Command seems to be on par with chiefs of staff of the branches? How significant is the Defense Board in the apparent absence of chiefs of staff in the branch from it? And I will ask you to please, Felix, if you can start by answering the question. Thank you very much.
Very briefly, we have not two, but three different influence makers. The Ministry of Defense, of course, they have the direction of the policy of defense. The Chief of Defense is responsible of the military planning for capabilities, but there is a third and very influential actor, which is the Secretary of State for Defense, which is responsible for the budget and for the industry. And they also have their say in this process. And that is why the final outcome of the military planning is a combination of what the three different branches want, the Chief of Defense believes is in line with international requirements for military cooperation with third countries. And if any, the political input of the Ministry of Defense in order to sustain the fiction that they have the military under a real control. Three actors, one final outcome, very easy to be decided and elaborated, but very difficult to be implemented, and also without any single clear accountable before the public opinion on the lawmakers, of course.
Thank you, Felix. Olivier, very briefly, the
Yes.
answer.
In some words, as for the chief of staff's question is concerned, yes, the joint process is now key of the efficiency of the French armed forces. So in terms of career, in terms of professional perspective, you can't but attend the French Joint War College if you want to really be at the center of the decision. That's the first point. But at the same time, one of the lessons of the 20 past years is that you can't have an effective joint integration without what the French call a strong organic culture, and that leads us to the branches. And this organic dimension, for which the different chiefs of staff in the different branches are responsible, must remain the prerogative of the different armed forces. Integration doesn't mean dilution, in fact. And whatever the all-domain, cross-domain, multi-domain doctrinal term could eventually be, the institutional merger of single services or branches in a single, unified, totally one ring to govern all of them is not on the agenda. So the institutional and organic prerogatives of the different chiefs of staff are really sanctuarized in the French process as for now. That's a delicate balance, but as for now, it is preserved. So it is, and it will remain important in the years coming. I assume this myself. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anthony King, for the last intervention, please. You are without sound, please. I'm sorry, you have the mute.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thanks, Bruno, for the question, which is a very tough one, and I'll try and answer it quickly. Just to confirm, under jointery, just to confirm for the whole audience, under jointery from 1998 and under integration from this year, 2021, the permanent joint headquarters, just like as I would interpret CPCO in Paris in France, remains subordinate operational command. It's a 3-star command, and the services are 4-star chiefs of general staff. So it remains subordinated, not in an operational command sense, but in a real sense to the services. Now, theoretically, what should happen is something rational in Britain, but anyone who knows Britain knows that the organizational structure will be crazy and sprawling and totally irrational. And here's the thing. So from 1998, the Chief of the Defence Staff should rule over everything, and the services should be subordinate to the Chief of the Defence Staff. That's not how it works. He's like the Holy Roman Emperor. He's been elected in, but actually has no actual power over the various kings and electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. So the service chiefs still have enormous power. Why? because they own the budgets and they own the procurement cycles and they own the promotion, as Felix and others have said earlier on today. So so there's just horse trading between the chief of the defence staff and the services, and he can persuade and cajole but not force. Now, the interesting thing with the integrated review is the setting up of UK strategic command. This may be a way by which the chief of the defence staff actually begins to exert some systematic control and authority over the other two services, because you'll see the cyber and space are under that. And also, of course, the new disruptive technologies will be procured and brought in underneath that command. And there is a much more direct relationship, and certainly a relationship of subordination to the Chief of Defence Staff. But what I put it to you is that it'll be complicated. And I'll just make a final point, which goes back to Olivia's. All of this, I think, will be finally worked out in reality. The reality of the operations that the armed forces actually have to do in the next 10 years. And as I say, one of the things here is that the British forces have equipped themselves, or will have equipped themselves by 2025 in such a way that actually, I think it's going to be quite difficult for them to do joint operations because the Air Force is going to want to fly its F-35s off Royal Navy aircraft carriers. And where does that leave joint operations, especially on the land? In an interesting place. So the situation is, as always, complicated in the UK, and I can't see any end to that, but it's a very important question. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you very much. I think the situation is not only complicated in the United Kingdom, it's complicated everywhere, as you can see in our experiences. Thank you very much for all our speakers, for your interesting and very reflective interventions. And I'm going to pass the final word to Elena to close this seminar. Thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. I just would like to thank all the participants, all the speakers, the chairs. Anna, in this case, thank you for your comments, your chairing of this session, your experiences as a former Secretary of Defense certainly led you to think about all the contexts that were mobilized in this debate. I would like also to thank all the participants who endured this rather long afternoon, and not aiming at any kind of synthesis. I think we can say that we learned a lot, that the objectives of this webinar have been accomplished, because we know now, we knew maybe before, that there are, of course, no perfect reforms. There are no linear models, no exportable models. We know this is complex, this is context driven, that we still can learn from other experiences. And I think this is what happened. What I can tell you is that the National Defense Institute will go on following all these reforms in fulfilling its role to promote public debate, to clarify questions that without debate are very sometimes difficult to clarify. And so we'll be here to follow all events related not only to these reform, but all to public defense, public policies in general. Thank you all for being with us, and keep safe. This is what I'd like to desire this end. Good afternoon. Maybe a virtual applause to all our
Thank you very much. Au revoir.
Thank you.